Doctors are supposed to be healers. They take an oath to do no harm, and we trust them with our lives during our most vulnerable moments. When we're sick, scared, or aging, they're the ones we turn to for help, for comfort, for protection. But for the victims in these cases, the person in the white coat wasn't a saviour. They were a predator. These weren't accidents or medical errors. These were calculated murders committed by licensed physicians who used their knowledge, their access, and their authority to kill the patients who trusted them most. The elderly. The people who should have been safe in hospitals and care facilities, receiving treatment from trained professionals, instead became victims of the very doctors sworn to protect them. Today we're covering medical professionals who went from healing to killing, the elderly patients they targeted, and the evidence that exposed their horrifying crimes. What you're about to hear are the real stories of doctors who betrayed everything their profession stands for, the investigations that brought them down, and the justice that followed. Case number 1. Harold Shipman was born on January 14, 1946, in Nottingham, England. He was the second of 3 children. His father drove trucks for a living. His mother's name was Vera. The family was working class, and no one in their family had ever gone to university before. Vera Shipman was close with her son Harold, who she called by his middle name Fred. She had high hopes for him. When Harold was 17 years old in 1963, his mother got lung cancer. She was only 42 years old. Harold watched as doctors came to their home to care for his dying mother. He saw them give her morphine injections to help with the pain. He noticed how the morphine made her pain go away, even though she was dying. He watched these visits carefully. His mother died on June 21, 1963, after receiving morphine treatment at home. This death affected him deeply. It also gave him a close look at how powerful painkillers worked. After his mother died, Harold decided he wanted to become a doctor. He studied hard and got into Leeds University Medical School in 1965. At medical school, he was a normal student who did not stand out much. While studying at Leeds, he met a young woman named Primrose Oxtoby on a bus. They started dating. In 1966, when Harold was 20 and Primrose was 17, they got married. She was already 5 months pregnant with their first child at the wedding. They would go on to have 4 children together. Harold graduated from medical school in 1970 with his medical degree. He started working as a doctor at Pontefract General Infirmary, doing his required training after graduation. He worked there for about 3.5 years. People thought he was a capable doctor, though some found him rude and controlling. In 1974, he took his first job as a general practitioner at the Abraham Ormerod Medical Centre in Todmorden, a town in West Yorkshire. He was now a family doctor, seeing patients in the community. Everything seemed fine at first. Shipman got involved in local activities like the Rochdale Canal Commission. He appeared to be a normal, hard-working doctor. But within a year, things started to go wrong. In 1975, people at the medical practice noticed something strange. Shipman was prescribing huge amounts of pethidine, a strong painkiller similar to morphine. When pharmacists checked with the patients, they found out these patients never received the drug. Shipman had been writing fake prescriptions and keeping the pethidine for himself. He was addicted to it and was injecting himself with the drug. When his partners at the medical practice confronted him, Shipman admitted he had become addicted to pethidine. He said the addiction started back in medical school. He claimed he had tried the drug by accident and got hooked. The truth was, he had been injecting himself with between 600 and 700 milligrams of pethidine every day. In February 1976, Shipman went to court at Halifax Magistrates Court. He pleaded guilty to obtaining drugs dishonestly, forging prescriptions, and illegally possessing pethidine. He asked the court to consider 74 other similar crimes. The court fined him £600 and sent him to a drug treatment centre called The Retreat in York. He stayed there from October to December 1975. The General Medical Council, which oversees doctors in Britain, decided not to remove his medical licence. They just gave him a warning. The Home Office did not ban him from prescribing controlled drugs in the future. This meant Shipman could keep working as a doctor with no restrictions. This was a huge missed opportunity to stop what would happen next. After treatment, Shipman briefly worked doing physical exams on coal miners. Then in 1977, he joined a group medical practice called Donnybrook Medical Centre in Hyde, Greater Manchester. The partners at this practice knew about his drug problem and criminal conviction, but they hired him anyway. In Hyde, Shipman started to rebuild his reputation. Patients liked him. He seemed hard-working and caring. He made house calls to see patients at home, which many doctors stopped doing. He spent time talking with patients and seemed interested in their problems. There was even a year-long waiting list to become his patient because he was so popular. But Shipman had problems working with other doctors. He had violent mood swings that made relationships with his partners difficult. By 1992, things got so bad that he left the group practice. He set up his own solo practice at 21 Market Street in Hyde in 1993. Now he was working completely alone, with no partners watching over him. This made it much easier for him to hide what he was doing. He had about 3,100 patients on his list. During all this time, Shipman was killing his patients. The first confirmed murder was in March 1975 in Todmorden. The victim was a woman named Eva Lyons. After that, he continued killing for 23 years. The Shipman inquiry later determined he killed at least 215 people, with serious suspicions about 45 more deaths. Other estimates put the number as high as 250 to 260 victims. Most were elderly women, though he killed 44 men as well. His youngest victim was 49 years old. Most victims were in good health when he killed them. Shipman used the same method for most murders. He would visit patients at their homes, usually in the afternoon during his rounds. He would inject them with a lethal dose of diamorphine, which is medical-grade heroin. The drug would kill them quickly and peacefully. Then Shipman would sign the death certificate, writing that they died of natural causes, like old age or heart attack. He would tell the family that no autopsy was needed. He often urged families to have the body cremated, which would destroy any evidence of the diamorphine in their system. To make his story believable, Shipman would go into his computer system and change the patient's medical records after they died. He would add notes saying the patient had heart problems or other conditions, even if they had been healthy. He thought this would back up his claim that they died naturally. What Shipman did not know was that the computer system recorded the date and time whenever he made changes to records. This would later prove he was lying. Shipman got the diamorphine the same way he got pethidine years earlier. He would write prescriptions for patients who might need strong painkillers, then collect the drugs from the pharmacy himself. He would keep the extra drugs instead of giving them to patients. Over 23 years, he built up enough diamorphine to kill over 200 people. No one was checking his drug records or tracking what happened to the medicine after he picked it up. People did notice strange things. A local undertaker saw that Shipman's patients seemed to die at an unusually high rate. He noticed many bodies were positioned the same way when found, fully dressed and sitting up or lying on sofas. This seemed odd. The undertaker even asked Shipman about it directly. Shipman told him not to worry, that everything was fine. The undertaker believed him. Other people had suspicions too. Staff at the medical practice where Shipman used to work nicknamed him Dr. Death because so many of his patients died. A taxi driver named John Shaw noticed that many elderly passengers he drove would die shortly after seeing Shipman. He told police about his suspicions in August 1998, but nothing came of it. In March 1998, another doctor finally spoke up. Dr. Linda Reynolds worked at the Brook Surgery on Market Street in Hyde, right across from Shipman's practice. She started comparing the number of deaths in her practice with the deaths in Shipman's practice. She found Shipman had far more deaths, especially among elderly women. She was particularly worried about how many cremation forms for elderly women Shipman asked her and other doctors to sign. She went to the coroner, John Pollard, and told him she was concerned Shipman might be killing patients, though she was not sure if it was bad medical care or actual murder. The coroner contacted Greater Manchester Police. They started a confidential investigation in March 1998. Detective Inspector David Smith led the investigation under Chief Superintendent David Sykes. But the police did not do a good job. They only looked at Shipman's paperwork and saw that his records appeared to be in order. They never checked his criminal history, which would have shown his 1976 conviction for forging prescriptions. They never contacted the General Medical Council. The investigation concluded there was no evidence of wrongdoing. On April 17, 1998, the police closed the case. The Shipman inquiry later found major problems with how the police handled this investigation. They assigned inexperienced officers who did not know how to investigate a doctor. They missed obvious warning signs. If they had done their job properly, they could have stopped Shipman, but they did not. Between April 17th, when the investigation ended, and Shipman's arrest in September, he killed 3 more people. The last victim was Kathleen Grundy. She was 81 years old, a wealthy widow, and a former mayor of Hyde. She was extremely active and healthy for her age. She worked with local charities and helped serve meals at an age concern club for elderly people. Everyone knew her as energetic and reliable. On June 23, 1998, Shipman visited Kathleen Grundy at her home. He told her he needed to take blood samples for a study on aging. The next morning, June 24th, he came back to her house at 8:30 a.m. to take the samples. Later that day, when Kathleen did not show up at the Age Concern Club, her friends got worried. She was never late. 2 friends, John Green and Ronald Pickford, went to check on her around midday. They found her front door unlocked. Inside, they found Kathleen lying fully dressed on her sofa. She was dead, and her body was already cold. They called Shipman right away. He came to the house and did a quick examination. He told them Kathleen died of old age and said her body should be taken away. He claimed he talked to someone at the coroner's office who agreed with this. Later, when police checked, there was no record of any such conversation. Shipman signed the death certificate listing the cause as old age. Kathleen's daughter, Angela Woodruff, was a lawyer who lived in Warwickshire. When she heard about her mother's death, she found Shipman's explanation strange but accepted it. Her mother was buried without an autopsy. Then, on the same day her mother died, something very suspicious happened. A lawyer named Brian Burgess contacted Angela about a new will for her mother. Angela was shocked. Her own law firm had always handled her mother's legal affairs. They had the original will from 1986. When Angela saw this new will, she immediately knew something was wrong. The will was badly typed on an old typewriter. It had spelling mistakes and poor grammar. Her mother was an extremely neat and careful person who never would have signed such a messy document. Even worse, the will left her mother's entire estate, worth £386,000, to Dr. Shipman. It gave nothing to Angela or her children. The signature looked strange and too big. The whole thing made no sense. Angela Woodruff was convinced the will was forged. On the advice of Brian Burgess, she went to the police in July 1998. This time the police took it seriously. Detective Superintendent Bernard Possils looked at the evidence and quickly agreed the will was fake. They started investigating both the forgery and Kathleen's death. Police got permission to dig up Kathleen's body. When they tested her tissues, they found morphine. Diamorphine breaks down into morphine in the body, so this proved she had been given diamorphine. The amount and timing showed she got a lethal dose about 3 hours before she died, right when Shipman visited her that morning. This completely contradicted his claim that she died of old age. When police questioned Shipman, he had a new story. He claimed Kathleen Grundy was secretly a drug addict. He said he had written notes about her addiction in his computer medical records. But when police experts examined his computer, they made a shocking discovery. The timestamps showed Shipman wrote those notes after Kathleen was already dead. He created fake medical records to cover up what he did. On September 7, 1998, police arrested Shipman. They searched his house and found important evidence. They discovered an old Brother typewriter that matched the one used to type the fake will. They found jewellery belonging to his dead patients. They found medical records he had taken home. They also found the typewriter ink and paper matched what was used for Grundy's forged will. Police began looking at other deaths Shipman had certified. They found a clear pattern. Many patients died right after Shipman visited them at home, usually in the afternoon. Many died sitting up or reclining on sofas, fully dressed. Shipman was present at 19% of all his patient deaths, while other doctors in similar practices were only present at 1% of deaths. This was a huge red flag. Investigators decided to focus on cases where bodies had not been cremated, so they could dig them up and test for drugs. They found 15 strong cases where they had good evidence. Shipman was charged with murdering 15 women between 1995 and 1998. Kathleen Grundy, Joan Melia, Winifred Meller, Bianca Pomfret, Ivy Lomas, Marie Quinn, Irene Turner, Jean Lilly, Muriel Grimshaw, Nora Nuttall, Laura Wagstaff, Maureen Ward, Pamela Hillier, Marie West, and Lizzie Adams. He was also charged with forging Kathleen Grundy's will. The trial started on October 5, 1999, at Preston Crown Court. Shipman's lawyers tried to have the Grundy case tried separately because it involved the forged will, which gave a clear motive for murder. The judge rejected this request. The trial would cover all 15 murders and the forgery together. The trial lasted 57 days. The prosecution argued that Shipman killed these women because he enjoyed having power over life and death. They said none of the victims were terminally ill or suffering, so he was not helping them die peacefully. He was murdering healthy people who trusted him. Angela Woodruff testified first. She told the jury about her mother and how she investigated when she knew the will was fake. Her testimony was powerful and believable. Shipman's lawyers tried to discredit her, but failed. The government's pathologist explained how morphine poisoning killed these women. Forensic experts showed how Shipman forged the will. Medical experts proved the patients were healthy before Shipman visited them. Throughout the trial, Shipman showed no emotion and never admitted any wrongdoing. He maintained he was innocent. The jury deliberated for 6 days. On January 31, 2000, they found him guilty on all counts, 15 murders and 1 forgery. Judge Mr. Justice Forbes sentenced Shipman to 15 life terms for the murders and 4 years for the forgery. The judge recommended that Shipman should never be released from prison. This is called a whole life order. On February 11, 2000, the General Medical Council permanently removed Shipman from the medical register. He could never practice medicine again. But the investigation did not stop. Police knew there were many more victims. A study by Professor Richard Baker from the University of Leicester analysed death rates in Shipman's practice compared to other doctors. The study found Shipman had 236 excess deaths between 1974 and 1998. Dame Janet Smith, a High Court judge, led the official Shipman inquiry. She and her team examined 888 deaths of Shipman's patients. The inquiry report, released in July 2002, made shocking findings. Dame Janet Smith concluded that Shipman definitely killed 215 patients between 1975 and 1998. She had real suspicions about 45 more deaths, but not enough evidence to be certain. In her final report in January 2005, she said Shipman may have killed 3 patients at Pontefract General Infirmary early in his career, including possibly a 4-year-old girl. The true number of victims will never be known because many bodies were cremated. Looking at the pattern, the inquiry found Shipman killed 1 person in Todmorden in 1975, then 71 patients while at the Donnybrook practice from 1977 to 1992. After opening his solo practice in 1992, his killing increased dramatically. He killed 1 patient in 1992, 16 in 1993, and 11 in 1994. Then the numbers jumped: 30 patients in 1995, 30 in 1996, and 37 in 1997. In the first 3 months of 1998 alone, he killed 15 people. Then there was a 7-week gap before he killed his final 3 victims, ending with Kathleen Grundy in June 1998. By the end, he was killing about 1 person per week. The victims showed a clear pattern. Out of the 215 confirmed murders, 171 were women and 44 were men. About 80% were female. Their ages ranged from 41 to 93, though most were elderly. The inquiry found that most victims were in good health when Shipman killed them. This showed he was not practicing mercy killing or euthanasia. He was murdering people who could have lived many more years. Dame Janet Smith said she could not determine Shipman's motive with certainty. In only one case, Kathleen Grundy, did he clearly benefit financially from the death. There was no evidence of sexual motives. He did not torture or abuse his victims. He killed them quickly with drug injections. Dame Janet suggested he might have been addicted to killing itself. The power and control over life and death may have been what drove him. Shipman was sent to Durham Prison after his conviction, then later moved to Wakefield Prison in West Yorkshire. He never confessed to anything. He never explained why he did it. He never showed remorse. His wife Primrose and their 4 children remained loyal to him. They believed he was innocent. Primrose visited him almost every day. On January 13, 2004, prison guards found Shipman dead in his cell. It was 1 day before his 58th birthday. He had hanged himself using bedsheets tied to the bars on his cell window. Some people believed he killed himself so his wife would get his pension and a lump sum payment, which she would lose if he died after turning 60. He had told his probation officer before this that he was thinking about suicide. Shipman took all his secrets to the grave. He never admitted what he did or explained why he did it. The Shipman case completely changed British medicine. It raised serious questions about how doctors are monitored and regulated. It showed how much power and trust doctors have, and how that trust can be abused. The case led to major reforms in how deaths are certified in the United Kingdom. The rules for cremation certificates were changed. Doctors now face much stricter oversight when prescribing controlled drugs. The Shipman inquiry made many recommendations to prevent this from ever happening again. They wanted better tracking of controlled drugs, with inspectors checking drug registers regularly. They limited how much could be prescribed at one time, now only 28 days worth. They recommended stopping doctors from prescribing controlled drugs for themselves or family members. They wanted better training for doctors on how to complete death certificates properly. The case also highlighted how solo doctors practicing alone face less scrutiny than those in group practices. When Shipman worked with partners, people could see what he was doing. When he worked alone after 1992, his killing rate increased dramatically. The isolation made it easier to hide his crimes. Looking back, many warning signs were missed. The 1975 conviction for forging prescriptions should have led to closer monitoring. The 1998 investigation by police should have uncovered the truth. The high death rates should have triggered automatic reviews. The unusual patterns, afternoon deaths, bodies sitting up, healthy patients suddenly dying, should have raised alarms earlier, but the system failed at every level. Part of the problem was that nobody wanted to believe a doctor could do this. Doctors occupy a special place in British society. They are highly respected and trusted. General practitioners especially are seen as pillars of the community. The idea that a GP could murder hundreds of patients seemed impossible. Even when people like the undertaker and the taxi driver had suspicions, they found it hard to believe their own instincts. Shipman exploited this trust ruthlessly. He knew people would believe a doctor over anyone else. He knew families would accept his explanations about natural deaths. He knew other doctors would sign cremation forms without too many questions. He used his position and authority as a shield to hide behind while he committed murder after murder. The impact on the families was devastating. Hundreds of people lost loved ones who should have lived many more years. They trusted Shipman to care for their elderly parents and grandparents. Instead, he killed them. Many families only found out the truth years later when the inquiry investigated. Some had to deal with the trauma of having their family member's body exhumed for testing. The betrayal of trust was complete and absolute. A memorial garden called the Garden of Tranquility was opened in Hyde Park in Hyde on July 30th, 2005 to honour Shipman's victims. Families of over 200 victims sought compensation for their losses. Some relatives never recovered from the trauma of learning their loved one was murdered by the doctor they trusted. Harold Shipman stands as one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. He killed at least 215 people, possibly as many as 260. He did it over 23 years. He did it while being respected and admired in his community. He did it while being called the best doctor in Hyde. He betrayed every principle of medicine which exists to help and heal people. Instead, he used his medical knowledge and access to drugs to kill vulnerable elderly people who put their complete trust in him. His crime shook Britain to its core and changed how the medical profession operates forever. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to case number 2. Case number 2. Frédéric Pétier was born in France in 1972. He became a doctor and specialised in anaesthesia, which is the medical practice of putting patients to sleep safely during surgery and managing their pain. By all accounts, he was very skilled at his job. Colleagues at the hospitals where he worked called him a star anaesthetist. Some said he was the best anaesthetist at the Saint Vincent Clinic in Besançon, a city in eastern France. Other doctors trusted him, and patients felt safe in his care, but Pétier had a dark side that no one saw at first. He was arrogant and manipulative, according to some co-workers. One colleague said Pétier was certain he was the best, and liked to think of himself as Zorro, the fictional hero who saves people. Another colleague described him as a very good doctor with an oversized ego. He had a need to be seen as superior to others. He also had conflicts with other anaesthetists at the clinics where he worked. These conflicts would drive him to commit terrible crimes. Péchier was a father of 3 children. He worked at 2 private clinics in Besançon, the Saint-Vincent Clinic and the Franche-Comté Polyclinic. Between 2008 and 2017, patients at these clinics started experiencing strange medical emergencies during routine surgeries. People who were healthy and having low-risk operations would suddenly go into cardiac arrest, meaning their hearts would stop beating. This happened far too often to be normal. The investigation that would eventually uncover the truth began in January 2017, after a shocking incident. A 36-year-old woman named Sandra Simard went in for spinal surgery. This was supposed to be a routine operation, but during the surgery, she suddenly suffered a cardiac arrest. Her heart stopped. Péchier was the anaesthetist managing her care. He quickly worked to save her life, and he did revive her. But then she fell into a coma that lasted 5 days. Sandra was rushed to Besançon University Hospital for emergency treatment. Doctors there decided to test the IV bags that had been used during her surgery. What they found was absolutely shocking. The IV bags contained potassium at levels 100 times higher than the normal dose. This was an enormous amount. Philippe Panouillot, an inspector with France's ARS Health Authority, said the dose was huge. He said it was a miracle that Sandra survived. For medical professionals, this discovery was terrifying. The clinic's management and the regional health authority immediately alerted prosecutors. An investigation was launched. Philippe Panouillot later said that the unthinkable began to dawn on them. They got scared and thought maybe there was someone who had been killing people for years in Besançon and nobody had noticed. They feared they had to stop the carnage, to stop the massacre. The health authority took immediate action. While Péchier was away on holiday, workers secretly replaced all the IV bags in the clinic at night. After that, the Saint-Vincent Clinic did not register any other suspicious medical emergencies. Nothing ever happened again after the IV bags were replaced. This strongly suggested that someone had been contaminating the bags. Péchier was arrested in March 2017. At first, he was above suspicion, according to Fabrice Charligny, a former police commander who led the investigation. Charligny told the court that at the start of the investigation, Dr. Péchier was above suspicion. He was the best anaesthetist at the Saint-Vincent Clinic. In the doctor's minds, it was unthinkable that he could be responsible. But as investigators dug deeper, a pattern emerged. Péchier was the common denominator in all the suspicious cases. He was most often found close to the operating room when these cardiac arrests occurred, and whenever a patient went into cardiac arrest, Péchier was always the first responder. He always had a solution. He would quickly diagnose the problem and take action, even when nothing allowed anyone to suspect an overdose of potassium or local anesthesia. Presiding Judge Delphine Thibierge later said that several earlier investigations into suspicious cardiac arrests had been unsuccessful. It was Sandra Simard's case that helped connect the dots. Once investigators started looking closely, they realised this had been going on for years. Investigators examined more than 70 reports of serious adverse events, medical terms for unexpected complications or deaths among patients, that occurred at the 2 clinics where Péchier worked. They found evidence that Péchier had been deliberately contaminating 1-fee infusion bags with dangerous substances. He used potassium, local anaesthetics like lidocaine, adrenaline, and even heparin, which is an anticoagulant that prevents blood clotting. These substances would trigger cardiac arrest or cause hemorrhaging in patients. The prosecutor's theory about why Péchier did this was chilling. They said he contaminated the IV bags used by colleagues with whom he was in conflict. He wanted to make healthy patients suddenly go into medical emergencies during operations performed by doctors he did not like. Then Péchier could rush in and save the day, showing off his resuscitation skills and making himself look like a hero. At the same time, this would make his rival colleagues look bad and incompetent. It would damage their professional reputation. Prosecutor Etienne Manteau said what Péchier was accused of was poisoning healthy patients in order to harm colleagues with whom he was in conflict. Prosecutor Christine de Carrez called Péchier highly twisted. She said he pursued a sick campaign of death against his patients and targeted colleagues he saw as a professional threat or with whom he had differences. The goal was to harm their careers and mess with their minds. Prosecutor Thérèse Bruneseau said Péchier was the opposite of what a doctor should be, a criminal who used medicine to kill and carry out slow and insidious psychological attacks on fellow doctors. In some cases, prosecutors said Pétier would actually revive victims after he had poisoned them. This demonstrated his power and helped deflect suspicion away from himself. It made him look like a skilled doctor who could handle emergencies, when in reality, he was the one creating those emergencies. Prosecutors said his actions fed a need for power that came from feelings of frustration and not being good enough. They said his goal was to psychologically hurt caregivers with whom he was in conflict and to feed his thirst for power. The victims ranged widely in age. The youngest was a 4-year-old boy named Teddy. In 2016, Teddy went in for a routine tonsil surgery, a common operation where doctors remove the tonsils from the throat. During this simple procedure, the little boy suffered 2 cardiac arrests. His heart stopped twice. He fell into a coma. Teddy survived, but the now 14-year-old suffered life-changing injuries. He struggles at school because of what happened to him. In a statement read by his father at the trial, Teddy's family said that to Pétier, their son was just an object to be used to settle scores with his professional rivals. The oldest victim was 89 years old. Most victims were elderly people, but many were in good health before their surgeries. One victim was a 53-year-old man who died of cardiac arrest during kidney surgery in 2008. His daughter, Amandine Yellen, waited 17 years for the trial to begin. An autopsy on her father revealed an overdose of lidocaine, a local anaesthetic. The charges eventually covered 30 patients who were poisoned between 2008 and 2017. 12 of these patients died. The other 18 survived, but many had lasting health problems. Sandra Simard, who survived her poisoning, described herself as intubated, tied up, and lost during her time in the coma. She experienced hallucinations, paranoia, and fear, along with terrible pain. She still suffers from memory problems, recurrent fatigue, and an intolerance to noise. Her hospital stay turned from what should have been 6 weeks into 6 months because of the poisoning. She told reporters that she did not think she had the right to complain because she was alive, unlike many other people. Another survivor, Jean-Claude Gandon, was 70 years old when he was poisoned during a urology operation, with Pétier as his anaesthetist. After the verdict, he said now they could have a quiet Christmas. Throughout the investigation and trial, Pétier maintained his innocence. At first, he argued that the majority of poisonings were the result of medical errors made by his colleagues. He said in 2017 that he was being accused of heinous crimes that he did not commit. He told reporters at a press conference in 2019 that whatever the outcome, his career was over. He said you cannot trust a doctor who at one point has been labelled a poisoner. He said his family was broken and he was afraid for his children. During the trial, which began in September 2025, Pétier changed his story slightly. He admitted that there had been a person poisoning patients in one of the 2 clinics where he worked, but he insisted it was not him. He repeatedly told the court, "I am not a poisoner." He denied all the charges and maintained his innocence throughout. When asked about the suffering of the families who attended the trial, Pétier replied that he understood it completely, but on the other hand, he was not responsible for their distress. This cold response showed his lack of empathy for the victims. Before the trial began, Pétier told broadcaster BFM TV that he was not particularly anxious. He said he had to fight one last time to bring this to an end. He told broadcaster RTL that it was necessary to lay all the cards on the table and that he had strong arguments in his defense. He said he was not tired and not angry, he just wanted people to listen for once. The trial began on September 8, 2025 in Besançon and lasted until December, spanning about 3.5 months. It was a massive trial. More than 150 civil parties were represented, including a trade union for anaesthetists. There were 55 lawyers representing the victims. One of these lawyers, Frederick Berner, said it was a dizzying case because of its scale, duration, and technical complexity. He said he doubted the court would hear any sincere and honest explanations from Pétier. He described Pétier as someone who does not take no for an answer and constantly tries to impose his opinion by force. The trial involved 15 weeks of hearings. The court had to examine each of the 30 cases individually, looking at medical testimony, forensic evidence, and emotional accounts from victims' families. The deliberation alone took 3 days, because the court had to rule separately on each poisoning case. Pétier showed little emotion during most of the trial, according to reports. But on December 5, 2025, he broke down in tears when speaking about his suicide attempt in 2021. His defense lawyer, Randall Schwerdorfer, explained that Petier is someone who has always been in control and does not like to show his emotions. Schwerdorfer said Petier had underestimated the difficulty of the trial and was convinced that the jurors would very quickly be convinced of his innocence. It also came out during the trial that Petier suffered from depression. He had attempted suicide in 2014. Then in 2021, he fell from a window at his parents' house while in a drunken state. Other psychological and psychiatric assessments did not identify any particular pathology or personality disorder. They described Petier as an intelligent man. Petier's defense team criticized the evidence against him. Lawyer Randall Schwerdorfer told reporters that it is very easy to accuse people, but harder to prove things. Another lawyer, Jean-Yves Le Borgne, argued that there was a possibility that Dr. Petier was the author of these poisonings, but this hypothesis was nothing but a hypothesis. He said the long inquiry had shown nothing to prove guilt, and that the presumption of innocence must be stressed. The defense asked for acquittal, arguing there was a lack of irrefutable evidence against Petier. Schwerdorfer later told RTL Radio that according to him, the case had constructed a culprit and left blind spots. The defense highlighted the difficulty of establishing direct evidence in a hospital environment, with numerous actions and distributed responsibilities. On Monday, December 16, 2025, the last day of the trial, Petier was given the floor for a final statement. He again denied the accusations, repeating claims he had maintained throughout the proceedings. On December 18, 2025, the Doubs Assize Court in Besançon delivered its verdict. The court found Frédéric Petier guilty of poisoning 30 patients, with 12 of those poisonings resulting in death. Judge Delphine Thibierge sentenced him to life imprisonment. She said he would be incarcerated immediately. The sentence included a minimum of 22 years before he would be eligible for parole. The court also permanently banned him from ever practicing medicine again, though he had already been banned from practicing since 2017. Prosecutors called him one of the greatest criminals in history. Prosecutor Thérèse Brunisseau told him during the trial, "You are Dr. Death, a poisoner, a murderer. You bring shame on all doctors. You have turned this clinic into a graveyard." Prosecutor Etienne Manteau had described the case as unprecedented in French legal history. The scale of the crimes, the duration of 9 years, and the technical complexity of proving medical poisoning made this a landmark case. Petier's lawyer, Randall Schwerdorfer, said he was convinced of his client's innocence and confirmed he would appeal the sentence. Under French law, Petier has 10 days to file an appeal. If successful, this would result in a complete retrial of the case. Until that happens, the verdict stands but is not final. The case highlighted serious issues about trust in medical professionals and the vulnerability of patients under anesthesia. When people go into surgery, they are completely unconscious and unable to protect themselves. They put their complete trust in doctors and nurses to keep them safe. Petier violated that trust in the worst possible way. Philippe Panouillot, the health inspector, said he regretted not having stopped Petier sooner. Looking back, there had been earlier investigations into suspicious cardiac arrests, but these had been unsuccessful. The medical community had found it unthinkable that a respected doctor could be doing this. The case also showed how someone in conflict with colleagues can weaponize medicine itself. Instead of resolving professional disagreements through proper channels, Petier allegedly turned operating rooms into crime scenes. He used his knowledge of anesthesia and access to dangerous drugs to harm innocent patients as a way to hurt his rivals. The investigation revealed that these were not medical accidents or errors. The concentrations of substances found in the IV bags were far too high to be mistakes. The pattern of incidents stopping completely after the IV bags were replaced showed deliberate contamination. The fact that Petier was always present and always the first to respond showed he knew what was happening because he had caused it. For the families of the 12 people who died, the verdict brought some closure after years of waiting for justice. For the 18 survivors who still deal with health problems from their poisoning, the trial acknowledged what happened to them. Many victims and families gave emotional testimony during the trial, sharing how their lives had been forever changed. One family member shouted, "Come on, Fredo," to encourage Petier when he arrived at court, showing that some relatives still believed in him or supported him despite the charges. This showed how the case divided people. The case also comes in a troubling context for France. Just months before Petier's trial began, another French doctor, retired physician Joël Le Squarnec, was sentenced to 20 years in prison in May 2025. He had confessed to sexually abusing or raping 298 patients, most of them children, between 1989 and 2014. That case raised questions about how he was allowed to continue practicing until retirement, despite at least one colleague sounding the alarm. The French medical community was reeling from these back-to-back scandals involving trusted doctors who betrayed their patients in horrific ways. Frédéric Péchier is currently 53 years old. He will spend at least 22 years in prison, meaning he will be in his mid-70s before he could even be considered for parole. Given the severity of his crimes and that he received a life sentence, it is possible he will never be released. His medical career is over. His reputation is destroyed. His family has been torn apart by his actions. The Besançon poisonings, as this case became known, stand as one of the most disturbing medical crimes in French history. Péchier used his position as a skilled anaesthetist to poison vulnerable patients over 9 years. He turned places of healing into places of danger. He betrayed the fundamental principle of medicine, to do no harm. Instead, he did tremendous harm to serve his own ego and to hurt colleagues he disliked. The victims ranged from a 4-year-old child to an 89-year-old elderly person. Their only mistake was trusting their doctor. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to case number 3. Case number 3. Dr. Nigel Cox was a well-respected consultant rheumatologist who worked at the Royal Hampshire County Hospital in Winchester, England. In 1992, he became one of the only doctors in British history to be convicted of attempted murder after he gave a lethal injection to one of his patients. The patient was a 70-year-old woman named Lillian Boyes, who had been suffering from severe rheumatoid arthritis for many years. This case became a landmark moment in British medical and legal history. It sparked a massive debate about whether doctors should be allowed to help dying patients end their suffering. The case forced people to confront difficult questions about death, pain, and compassion, and it all began with a doctor-patient relationship that had lasted more than a decade. Nigel Lee Cox was born in 1945 in Surrey, England. He spent years training to become a doctor and eventually specialised in rheumatology. Rheumatology is a branch of medicine that deals with diseases affecting the joints, bones, muscles, and connective tissues. Doctors in this field often treat conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, which is exactly what brought Lillian Boyes into Dr. Cox's care. He had been treating her for 13 years before the events that would change both their lives forever. During those 13 years, Cox watched as Lillian's conditions slowly destroyed her body. Rheumatoid arthritis is not like normal arthritis that many older people experience. It is an autoimmune disease. This means that the body's own immune system attacks healthy tissue by mistake. The immune system is supposed to protect the body from germs and infections. But in people with rheumatoid arthritis, it turns against the lining of the joints instead. This causes severe inflammation, swelling, and pain. Over time, it can destroy the joints completely. It can also spread beyond the joints and damage other parts of the body, including the skin, eyes, lungs, heart, and blood vessels. The disease is chronic, meaning it never goes away. Patients can have periods where symptoms get better, but then flare-ups bring the pain and swelling back even worse than before. For Lillian Boyes, those 13 years of treatment brought her condition to a point that was almost impossible to imagine. Lillian Boyes entered the Royal Hampshire County Hospital in 1991. By this point, her rheumatoid arthritis had ravaged her body in ways that are difficult to describe. She had developed ulcers and abscesses on both her arms and both her legs. These were open wounds that would not heal properly because her body was so weakened by disease. She had a rectal sore that was so deep and severe that it had penetrated all the way down to the bone. Just think about that for a moment. A wound so bad that it had eaten through all the tissue and reached the bone itself. She had fractured vertebrae in her spine. The bones in her back had broken because her body was so fragile. On top of all this, she had developed gangrene. Gangrene is when body tissue dies because it is not getting enough blood flow. This can happen as a side effect of steroid treatments, which are often given to patients with severe arthritis to help control inflammation. The steroids had helped with some of her symptoms over the years, but had also contributed to this terrible complication. Lillian Boyes weighed just 42 kilograms by this point. That is about 93 pounds or 6 stone 9 inches in British measurements. She was wasting away. Her body had been consumed by disease. The hospital chaplain who visited her during this time later gave testimony that still haunts anyone who reads it. He said that when anyone touched Lillian, you could hear her bones moving about in their joints. Just the slightest touch would cause the bones to shift and grind against each other. The chaplain said those words would stay with him to the grave. He would never forget the sound of a woman's skeleton moving beneath her skin. In the days before her death, Lillian Boys made her wishes very clear. She begged the medical staff to end her life. She pleaded with them to stop her suffering. She asked Dr. Cox directly to help her die. At first, he refused. This was not something doctors were allowed to do under British law. Ending a patient's life on purpose was considered murder, no matter how much pain that patient was experiencing. 5 days before she died, Lillian made a final decision. She rejected all treatment other than painkillers. She was giving up her fight. She signed what the court would later describe as her own death warrant. She wanted nothing more than to die and escape the agony she was living through every single day. Her sons watched all of this happen. They saw their mother suffering more and more with each passing day. They supported her decision. They understood that she could not take it anymore. Nobody who saw Lillian Boys in her final days could blame her for wanting it to end. A nurse who cared for her said that Lillian howled and screamed like a dog when anybody touched her. The slightest contact with her body caused her to cry out in uncontrollable pain. Even the routine tasks of nursing care were torture for her. Changing her position in bed, checking her vital signs, giving her medications. Each of these simple acts caused her to scream in agony. She was receiving 50 milligrams of diamorphine per hour at this point. Diamorphine is the medical name for heroin. It is a powerful painkiller that is used in hospitals to treat severe pain, especially in cancer patients and people who are dying. But even this was not enough to stop Lillian's suffering. By August 16, 1991, the medical staff at the Royal Hampshire County Hospital did not expect Lillian Boys to survive the day. She was clearly in the final hours of her life. Her body was shutting down, but those final hours were filled with unbearable suffering. Dr. Cox tried to help her. He administered 100 milligrams of diamorphine. This was a massive dose. It was the kind of dose that could easily kill a healthy person. In dying patients, such doses are sometimes given because they need enormous amounts of painkillers to get any relief at all. But even this huge dose did nothing for Lillian. She was still crying out in pain. Her body could not absorb the medication properly anymore. The painkiller was not working. She was going to die anyway, but she was going to die screaming. Dr. Cox was faced with a terrible choice. He had been this woman's doctor for 13 years. He had watched the disease slowly destroy her. He had tried everything medicine could offer to ease her suffering. And now, in her final moments, nothing was working. She had begged him to end her life. Her sons had supported this wish, and she was dying in agony with no way to help her. In Dr. Cox's own words, the pain in her last few days was like something he had never seen before in his entire medical career. She was howling with pain. He said she had pleaded with him directly. She told him to please give her a cup of tea and an injection so she could go to sleep. She told him she wanted to go. Dr. Cox made his decision. He took 2 ampules of potassium chloride. This is a very different substance from diamorphine. Diamorphine is a painkiller. Potassium chloride is not. Potassium chloride has no ability to relieve pain at all. What potassium chloride does is stop the heart. When injected directly into the bloodstream in large amounts, it interrupts the electrical signals that make the heart beat. The heart muscle stops contracting. The person dies almost immediately. Dr. Cox injected Lillian Boys with 2 ampules of undiluted potassium chloride. This was twice the amount that would normally be fatal. Within minutes, Lillian Boys was dead. Her suffering was finally over. After Lillian died, her son Patrick was at her bedside. He thanked Dr. Cox for what he had done. The family understood exactly what had happened. They knew that Dr. Cox had deliberately ended their mother's life, and they were grateful. They had watched her suffer for so long. They had heard her beg for death. They were relieved that her pain had finally stopped. Dr. Cox later stated his belief that he had probably shortened Lillian's life by somewhere between 15 minutes and an hour. She was going to die that day, no matter what. He had simply made sure she did not have to spend those final minutes, or that final hour, screaming in agony. He said this lady was going to die in a few minutes anyway. His intervention made very little difference, except for those last few moments of comfort or discomfort. The difference between dying in peace and dying in terrible pain. Dr. Cox did not try to hide what he had done. He entered the amount of potassium chloride he had used into the hospital log. He wrote down exactly what medication he had given and how much. He recorded it just like any other treatment. He then signed the official cause of death certificate. He listed the cause of death as bronchial pneumonia. This was not unusual. Patients dying of conditions like Lillian's often do develop pneumonia in their final days. Their weakened bodies cannot fight off infections. But the true cause of death was not pneumonia. It was the injection that Dr. Cox had given her. The truth came out because a nurse noticed the entry in the hospital log. She saw that Dr. Cox had administered potassium chloride to Lillian Boyes. She knew that potassium chloride was not a painkiller. She knew what giving that drug to a patient would do, and she reported it. The nurse felt she had an obligation to report what she had seen. This set off a chain of events that would lead all the way to criminal charges. Dr. Cox was arrested and charged with attempted murder. He was suspended from his position at the Royal Hampshire County Hospital. The suspension would last for 18 months. However, during this time, he was allowed to continue teaching at another hospital. He was also allowed to continue his private practice. He was not completely cut off from medicine, but his career and reputation were now in serious jeopardy. The case went all the way to Winchester Crown Court. The trial took place in September 1992. The judge presiding over the case was Mr. Justice Ognall. This was not a simple case for anyone involved. The facts were not in dispute. Dr. Cox admitted that he had given Lillian Boyes the injection of potassium chloride. Everyone agreed on what had happened. The question was what it meant under the law. The prosecution and defence disagreed about one crucial point. What was Dr. Cox's primary intention when he gave that injection? The prosecution argued that his intention was to kill Lillian Boyes. He gave her a substance that had no medical purpose other than to stop her heart. Therefore, he intended to cause her death. That made him guilty of attempting to murder her. The defence argued differently. They said that Dr. Cox's intention was to relieve his patient's suffering. He had tried everything else. Nothing had worked. The only way left to end her pain was to end her life. His primary goal was not to kill her, but to help her. This distinction between intending to kill and intending to relieve suffering is crucial in medical ethics. It relates to something called the doctrine of double effect. This is a principle that says doctors are allowed to give treatments that might shorten a patient's life, as long as their primary intention is to relieve suffering and not to cause death. For example, giving very high doses of painkillers to a dying patient is allowed, even though those doses might speed up death. The goal is to stop the pain, not to kill the patient. But potassium chloride does not fit this principle. It has no ability to relieve pain, it only stops the heart. A doctor cannot claim to be relieving suffering when the drug being used has no pain-relieving properties at all. The only thing potassium chloride does is cause death. The trial was emotionally difficult for everyone involved. The jury heard all the details of Lillian Boyes' suffering. They heard how she had begged to die. They heard how her own family supported Dr. Cox's actions. They heard how he had tried everything else before making this final decision. They heard testimony from the hospital chaplain about the sound of her bones moving. They heard nurses describe her screaming in pain, and they had to decide whether this compassionate doctor, trying to help a dying woman escape her agony, was guilty of attempted murder. The charge was attempted murder rather than murder for a technical legal reason. Lillian Boyes had been cremated before any post-mortem examination could be carried out. Because of this, it was impossible to prove beyond doubt that the potassium chloride injection was actually what killed her. She was dying anyway. She might have died from her disease in those same minutes, even without the injection. So the prosecution could not prove that the injection caused her death, but they could prove that Dr. Cox intended for it to cause her death. That was enough for a charge of attempted murder. The jury deliberated for more than 8 hours spread over 2 days. When they returned with their verdict, it was a majority decision of 11-1. They found Dr. Nigel Cox guilty of attempted murder. There were gasps in the courtroom when the verdict was announced. 3 of the jurors were openly weeping. They had done their duty under the law. They had followed the evidence and reached the only verdict that was legally possible, but doing so had clearly caused them emotional pain. The judge himself acknowledged how difficult this case had been. Mr. Justice Ognall told the jury that there are times when a criminal trial is an almost overwhelming burden. This was clearly one of those times. When it came time for sentencing, the judge had to balance the demands of the law against the circumstances of the case. Dr. Cox had broken the law. He had deliberately ended a patient's life. Under normal circumstances, someone convicted of attempted murder would face a severe prison sentence, but these were not normal circumstances. The judge gave Dr. Cox a 12-month prison sentence, but suspended it for 1 year. This meant that Dr. Cox would not actually go to prison unless he committed another offence within that year. He was essentially set free. The suspended sentence reflected the unique nature of the case. Dr. Cox was not a dangerous criminal. He was not going to harm anyone else. He was a caring doctor who had made a decision motivated by compassion for a suffering patient. Sending him to prison would serve no real purpose. Lillian Boy's family supported Dr. Cox throughout the entire trial. Her son Patrick spoke publicly about what had happened. He said his mother would have been horrified that her death had resulted in this trial. The family had wanted her suffering to end. Dr. Cox had made that happen. They did not see him as a criminal. They saw him as a compassionate doctor who had done the right thing for their mother. Another of Lillian's sons, John, also spoke about the case. He said his mother was suffering terribly, and Dr. Cox's action saved her several hours of suffering. The family did not blame the doctor at all. They were grateful to him. After his conviction, Dr. Cox still faced the question of whether he would be allowed to continue practicing medicine. The General Medical Council is the body that regulates doctors in the United Kingdom. They have the power to strike doctors off the medical register, which would permanently end their careers. In November 1992, just 2 months after his conviction, the Professional Conduct Committee of the General Medical Council held a hearing to consider Dr. Cox's case. They decided to take no further action against him. They did not strike him off. They did not revoke his license to practice medicine. This was a remarkable decision. Here was a doctor who had been convicted of attempted murder, and yet the medical establishment decided he should be allowed to keep working as a doctor. The decision was controversial. Some people believed that any doctor who deliberately ended a patient's life should never be allowed to practice again. Others believed that the exceptional circumstances of the case justified keeping Dr. Cox in the profession. He had shown poor judgment in one terrible situation, but he was not a danger to patients in general. The campaigners who supported the right to die praised the General Medical Council's decision. They saw it as an acknowledgement that sometimes doctors face impossible choices and that compassion should not always be punished. Dr. Cox returned to his former job at the Royal Hampshire County Hospital in February 1993. He was required to work under supervision for a period of time, but he was back doing the work he had trained for. His career was not over. His patients welcomed him back. They remembered him as a caring and dedicated doctor who had helped them through difficult times with their own illnesses. The case of Dr. Nigel Cox had consequences that reached far beyond one doctor and one patient. It became part of a national conversation about end-of-life care in the United Kingdom. Just a few months before Dr. Cox's trial, another landmark case had reached the courts. This was the case of Tony Bland. Tony Bland was a young man who had been severely brain damaged during the Hillsborough Stadium disaster in 1989. He had been in a persistent vegetative state for 4 years. His parents and doctors wanted permission to remove his feeding tube and allow him to die. In February 1993, the House of Lords ruled that this would be lawful. These two cases happening around the same time forced British society to confront difficult questions about death and medicine. Should doctors be allowed to help patients die? Should patients have the right to choose when their lives end? How much suffering is too much? Where is the line between compassionate care and killing? The British government responded by setting up a House of Lords Select Committee on Medical Ethics. This committee was tasked with examining the issues of euthanasia and end-of-life care. They took submissions from many different organisations and individuals. The Department of Health, the Home Office, the British Medical Association, and the Royal College of Nursing all argued against any change in the law. They believed that allowing euthanasia would be dangerous and could lead to abuse. The committee conducted extensive hearings throughout 1993. In February 1994, they published their report. Despite some expectations that the committee might support changes to allow euthanasia in certain circumstances, their conclusion was unanimous. They ruled that there should be no change in the law to permit euthanasia. Lord Walton, the chairman of the committee, explained their reasoning. They concluded that it was virtually impossible to ensure that all acts of euthanasia were truly voluntary. They feared that any liberalisation of the law could be abused. Elderly or vulnerable patients might feel pressured to ask for death, even if they did not truly want it. Families might put pressure on dying relatives to request euthanasia rather than continue costly medical care. Doctors might make life or death decisions based on factors other than the patient's wishes. The committee believed that keeping euthanasia illegal was the safest option for protecting vulnerable people. The impact of the Cox case continued to be felt in British law and medicine for years afterward. It established important legal principles about what doctors can and cannot do for dying patients. The case confirmed that while doctors can give large doses of painkillers to relieve suffering, even if those drugs might shorten life, they cannot deliberately use substances that have no medical purpose other than to cause death. The intent matters. Relieving pain is acceptable. Deliberately killing is not. Other doctors faced similar situations in the years that followed. Some were prosecuted, some were acquitted. The law remained complex and sometimes seemed inconsistent. In 1999, another British doctor named David Moore was put on trial for the murder of a terminally ill patient. Like Dr. Cox, Dr. Moore had administered drugs to a dying patient. Unlike Dr. Cox, Dr. Moore was acquitted. The difference was that Dr. Moore had used diamorphine, which is a painkiller, rather than potassium chloride, which is not. The jury accepted that Dr. Moore's intention was to relieve pain, even if the result was to hasten death. The cases showed how much depended on the specific circumstances and the drugs used. The debate about euthanasia in the United Kingdom continued through the following decades. Several attempts were made to introduce laws that would allow some form of assisted dying. All of them failed. The 1994 Select Committee report continued to be cited by governments of both major political parties as a reason to oppose changes in the law. Religious groups, disability rights advocates, and medical associations continued to argue against legalisation. The Cox case remained a reference point in these debates. It showed what could happen when a compassionate doctor stepped outside the law. It showed the impossible situations that doctors sometimes face. And it showed that the legal system, while upholding the law, could also show mercy through suspended sentences and decisions not to end careers. Dr. Nigel Cox himself largely stayed out of the public spotlight after returning to work. He had experienced something that no doctor would want to go through. He had been arrested, put on trial, convicted of attempted murder, and publicly judged for the most difficult decision of his career. Yet he continued practicing medicine. He continued helping patients with rheumatoid arthritis and other conditions. The patients he treated after his conviction knew who he was and what he had done. Many of them continued to trust him with their care. They understood that the decision he had made for Lillian Boyes had come from a place of compassion, not cruelty. The case raised questions that still have no easy answers today. What should a doctor do when a patient is dying in agony and nothing works to relieve their pain? What happens when the only way to end suffering is to end life itself? Should the law make exceptions for cases where death is inevitable and the only question is how much pain the person will endure before they die? Different countries have come to different conclusions. The Netherlands legalised euthanasia in 2002. Belgium followed shortly after. Switzerland allows assisted suicide under certain conditions. Several US states have passed laws allowing terminally ill patients to request life-ending medications, but the United Kingdom has continued to maintain its prohibition on assisted dying. The law remains largely the same as it was when Dr. Cox was convicted in 1992. Lillian Boyes did not want to be famous. She did not want her death to become a landmark legal case. She simply wanted her suffering to end. In her final days, she begged for release from a body that had become a prison of pain. She asked the doctor who had cared for her for 13 years to help her die in peace. And he did. The sound of her bones moving beneath her skin, the howling screams when anyone touched her, the wounds that penetrated to the bone, the gangrene spreading through her wasted body. These details paint a picture of suffering that is almost impossible for healthy people to imagine. She weighed 93 pounds. She could not absorb painkillers properly. She was going to die no matter what anyone did. The only question was whether her final minutes would be spent in peace or in torment. Dr. Cox chose peace. The law said he was wrong to make that choice, but Lillian's family, the people who knew her best and loved her most, thanked him for it. The case of Dr. Nigel Cox and Lillian Boyes remains one of the most significant moments in the history of British medical ethics. It forced a nation to confront the reality of death and suffering. It tested the boundaries between law and compassion. It showed that sometimes there are no good choices, only terrible ones. And it reminded everyone that behind the legal arguments and ethical debates, there are real people experiencing real pain, begging for relief that the law may not allow them to have. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to case number 4. Case number 4. Dr. Reynaldo Rivera Ortiz Jr. was an anesthesiologist working in Dallas, Texas. He spent years putting patients to sleep before surgeries and making sure they felt no pain during medical procedures. That was his job. He was supposed to help people. He was supposed to heal them. Instead, in 2022, he became responsible for one of the most disturbing crimes in modern American medical history. He secretly injected dangerous drugs into IV bags at the surgical center where he worked. Those bags were then used on unsuspecting patients during routine operations. The patients had no idea what was happening to them. They came in for simple cosmetic procedures like facelifts and tummy tucks. They expected to go home the same day. Instead, their hearts started racing out of control. Their blood pressure shot through the roof. Some of them nearly died on the operating table. And one of his own colleagues, a fellow doctor who had done nothing wrong, did die. She took one of those poisoned bags home to treat herself for dehydration. Minutes later, she was dead. In November 2024, Ortiz was sentenced to 190 years in federal prison for his crimes. The judge who handed down the sentence said his actions were the same as attempted murder. The prosecutor compared him to someone spraying bullets into a crowd. This is the story of how a man who had sworn an oath to do no harm ended up deliberately poisoning the very patients he was supposed to protect. Reynaldo Rivera Ortiz Jr. was born in 1964. He grew up to become a doctor, earning his medical degree from the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston in 1989. He completed his residency training there as well. By February 1991, he was a licensed physician in the state of Texas. He chose to specialize in anesthesiology. An anesthesiologist is a doctor who gives patients medications to put them to sleep during surgery. They also manage pain and monitor vital signs throughout medical procedures. It is a position of enormous trust. Patients literally put their lives in the hands of their anesthesiologist. When you are unconscious on an operating table, you are completely vulnerable. You trust that the doctors and nurses around you will keep you safe. Ortiz had that trust placed in him thousands of times over his career. For years, he worked at various medical facilities throughout the Dallas area, but behind the white coat, Ortiz had a dark history that most of his patients never knew about. Long before the IV bag tampering, Ortiz had shown signs of being a dangerous man. The Texas Medical Board had records of multiple incidents involving violence and misconduct stretching back decades. In June 1995, Ortiz was arrested for assault causing bodily injury to a spouse. The victim was his wife at the time. They eventually divorced and settled for an undisclosed amount of money. About 10 years later, in September 2005, a second woman filed for an emergency protective order against Ortiz. She claimed he had assaulted her. Then, in December 2014, Ortiz was arrested again. This time it was for assault involving domestic violence against a third woman. Once again, there was a settlement for an undisclosed sum. The pattern was clear. 3 different women over nearly 20 years had accused Ortiz of violence. The Texas Medical Board would later note in its records that Ortiz had a documented history of violence against women. But despite all of this, he was allowed to continue practicing medicine. The animal cruelty case revealed even more about the kind of person Ortiz really was. In December 2014, around the same time as his third domestic violence arrest, Ortiz's girlfriend at the time decided to leave him. A neighbor named Roxanne Bogdan helped the woman move out of Ortiz's house. Police had been called to the residence because of a domestic dispute. Bogdan later testified at a protective order hearing against Ortiz on behalf of the woman she had helped escape. Ortiz was furious about this. He blamed Bogdan for the breakup, and he decided to take revenge. In 2015, Ortiz shot Bogdan's dog with a pellet gun. He hit the animal in the chest. The dog survived but was seriously injured. Bogdan heard the shot and immediately suspected it was Ortiz. She knew it was him because she recognized the distinctive roar of his loud sports car when he pulled into his driveway. She had also noticed over the years that Ortiz frequently shot rabbits in his yard, and wounded animals would run into her property and die there. When police questioned him, Ortiz denied everything. He claimed he did not have any weapons because his ex-girlfriend had taken them all. Then he stopped cooperating with investigators. He was supposed to meet with a detective at the police station, but left the lobby before the detective even arrived to greet him. In June 2016, a Collin County jury found Ortiz guilty of cruelty to a non-livestock animal. It was a Class A misdemeanor, but also considered a crime of moral turpitude. He was sentenced to 25 days in jail, 2 years of community supervision, and a fine of $4,000. He was also ordered to pay over $500 for the dog's veterinary bills. The court required him to attend anger management counseling and prohibited him from harassing or threatening his ex-girlfriend, her children, and his neighbours. An appellate court later upheld the conviction. The medical board took action against Ortiz for this conviction, but it was surprisingly lenient. In October 2018, the board publicly reprimanded him and fined him $2,000. His clinical privileges were suspended for just 14 days. The discipline was mainly for failing to report the conviction to the board. He should have disclosed it, and he did not. The board let him continue practicing medicine. Then came another incident that should have raised even more red flags. In November 2020, Ortiz was performing anesthesia on a patient at the North Garland Surgery Center when something went terribly wrong. The patient required CPR and had to be rushed to another hospital for emergency care. An internal review found that Ortiz had failed to meet the standard of care. He did not recognize that the patient was not getting enough oxygen. He did not respond appropriately when the patient needed resuscitation. He also failed to properly document what had happened in the medical records. The surgery center's medical executive committee issued an adverse recommendation against him. Ortiz was forced to give up his medical staff membership and all clinical privileges at that facility. In August 2022, the Texas Medical Board took action again. They ordered his practice to be monitored by another physician. They fined him $3,000. They required him to take additional education in medical record keeping and resuscitation techniques. But even after all of this, Ortiz was still allowed to work as an anesthesiologist. He had been practicing medicine for over 30 years, despite domestic violence arrests, an animal cruelty conviction, and a documented pattern of poor patient care. By early 2022, Ortiz was working at Baylor Scott & White Surgicare North Dallas. This was an outpatient surgical center on Coit Road, where patients came for relatively simple procedures. Things like cosmetic surgeries, sinus operations, and other routine outpatient treatments. It was supposed to be a safe place. Most patients went home the same day. The facility had low complication rates because the surgeries performed there were generally low risk. Then things started to go wrong in a way nobody could explain. In May 2022, just days after Ortiz was notified that he was under disciplinary investigation at the surgical center for a previous incident, patients started experiencing severe medical emergencies during routine procedures. The timing was suspicious. Ortiz had allegedly deviated from the standard of care during an anesthesia procedure when one of his patients had a medical emergency. He was facing potential loss of his position at the surgical center. This would have been financially devastating for him. According to records, Ortiz already owed the IRS more than $4 million in unpaid taxes. He could not afford to lose his job. He was also complaining to other doctors at the facility about the investigation. He told colleagues he felt like the center was trying to crucify him. And then, mysteriously, other doctors' patients started having cardiac emergencies during their surgeries. The incidents happened on or around May 26th and 27th, then again on June 27th, then July 7th, 15th and 18th, then August 1st, 4th, 9th, 19th and 24th. Patient after patient came in for routine procedures and suddenly experienced dangerous spikes in blood pressure, cardiac dysfunction and other life-threatening complications. The doctors performing the surgeries were baffled. They could not figure out what was going wrong. The patients were different ages with different medical histories, different nurses were involved in each case, different operating rooms were used. The anesthesia machines were checked and serviced, drug recalls were investigated. Nothing explained why so many patients were suddenly having cardiac emergencies during procedures that should have been safe. Ashley Burks, the administrator at the surgical centre, later testified about how desperate the staff was to find answers. In 2021, the entire year, only 5 patients had to be transferred to hospitals because of complications or emergencies. But during just a 4-month period in 2022, that number jumped to 14. The staff knew something was very wrong, but they could not figure out what. Then came June 21, 2022. Dr. Melanie Casper was a 55-year-old anesthesiologist who also worked at the Baylor Scott & White Surgicare facility. She had worked there earlier that day. At some point, she started feeling sick. She was dehydrated. Like many healthcare workers, she knew a simple IV drip of saline could help her feel better quickly. She took an IV bag from the surgical centre and brought it home to her house in the Lakewood neighbourhood of Dallas. Her husband, John Casper, was there when she hooked herself up to the IV. They had been married for 30 years. They met at Texas A&M and got married 3.5 years later. Melanie was a beloved doctor who was well respected by her patients and colleagues. Within minutes of attaching the IV bag to herself, Melanie experienced a massive cardiac event. Her heart stopped. John watched his wife collapse. He called 911, but it was too late. Melanie Caspar was dead before the ambulance arrived. At first, nobody knew why. A healthy 55-year-old doctor had just died in her own home from what appeared to be a heart attack. It seemed like a tragic accident. The medical examiner ruled her death accidental initially, but the case was later reopened for further investigation. On August 24, 2022, everything came to a head. An 18-year-old named Jack Adlerstein came to the surgical centre for a routine rhinoplasty. He had fallen from a dirt bike and needed surgery on his nose. It was supposed to be a simple outpatient procedure. Instead, during the operation, Jack's condition suddenly became critical. His blood pressure spiked dangerously high. He went into cardiac arrest. Doctors had to perform chest compressions on his young body while they waited for paramedics to arrive. He was intubated and rushed to a nearby hospital, where he spent several days in the ICU fighting for his life. Jack later testified at trial that when he woke up, he really did not have a nose anymore because the cardiac emergency was so severe that doctors could not finish the surgery. He thought he was going to die. After Jack's emergency, Dr. Chad Marsden, another anesthesiologist at the facility, finally put the pieces together. He had been suspicious for weeks. One of his own patients had experienced a similar emergency the week before. He had started to wonder if something was contaminating the IV bags. It sounded outlandish, even crazy, but nothing else explained what was happening. After Jack was transported to the hospital, Marsden gave strict instructions that nothing should leave the operating room. He examined everything, looking for anything out of place. Then he found it. The wrapper from the IV bag that had been used on Jack had a small hole in it, a tiny puncture that should not have been there. Marsden immediately contacted Ashley Burks. He told her to get an IV bag directly from the manufacturer's box rather than from the warming bin. The surgical centre shut down operations immediately. Investigators obtained IV bags from the facility and began testing them. What they found was horrifying. Some of the bags had visible tiny holes in the plastic wrapping. Laboratory analysis revealed that those bags contained drugs that should never have been there. Specifically, they found bupivacaine, which is a nerve-blocking agent used in anaesthesia. This drug can be lethal when administered unknowingly through an IV. The bags also contained epinephrine, a stimulant that can cause the heart to race out of control. Some bags also contained lidocaine, another anaesthetic. None of these drugs should have been in simple saline IV bags. Someone had deliberately injected them into the bags. The autopsy results from Melanie Caspar came back around the same time. The Dallas County Medical Examiner determined that she had died from bupivacaine toxicity. The same drug found in the tampered IV bags was the drug that killed her. She had unknowingly poisoned herself with a bag that someone had deliberately contaminated. Federal investigators from the FDA Office of Criminal Investigations joined Dallas police to identify the person responsible. They had more than 250 personnel with access to the facility to consider. They reviewed surveillance footage from cameras that had been installed at the surgical centre in May 2022. Within weeks, they had their suspect. The footage showed Dr. Ronaldo Ortiz repeatedly doing something very strange. He was seen taking IV bags from the warming bin outside the operating rooms and then putting them back. This was not his job. Nurses typically handled IV bags. Doctors did not normally stock the warmer or retrieve bags one at a time, but Ortiz was doing exactly that on multiple occasions. And each time he placed a bag in the warmer, shortly afterward, a patient in a different doctor's surgery would experience a cardiac emergency. One piece of surveillance footage was particularly damning. It showed Ortiz walking quickly from an operating room to the bag warmer. He placed a single IV bag inside. Then he looked both directions down the empty hallway, as if checking to make sure no one was watching. Then he quickly walked away. Just over an hour later, a 56-year-old woman suffered a cardiac emergency during a cosmetic surgery procedure after a bag from that warmer was used during her operation. Another video showed Ortiz leaving an operating room while carrying an IV bag concealed inside what appeared to be a paper folder. He walked to the warmer, swapped that bag for another one, and walked away. About 30 minutes later, a 54-year-old woman suffered a cardiac emergency after receiving an IV bag from the same warmer. Other footage showed Ortiz filling large syringes with medications from different vials and then putting the syringes in his pocket. Surveillance video also captured him watching as victims were wheeled out of the building by emergency responders. He stood there and watched the chaos he had created. A nurse who worked with Ortiz reported something suspicious. She told investigators that during one of his own surgeries, Ortiz had refused to use an IV bag she retrieved from the warmer for his patient. He physically waved the bag away and insisted he would get his own. He knew those bags might be contaminated because he was the one contaminating them. He made sure his own patients never received the poisoned bags, but he was perfectly happy to let his colleagues use them on their patients. On September 9, 2022, the Texas Medical Board suspended Ortiz's medical license. They stated that his continuation in the practice of medicine posed a continuing threat to public welfare. 5 days later, on September 14, 2022, Dallas police arrested Ortiz in Plano on a federal warrant. He was 59 years old at the time. He was booked into the Dallas County Jail and held without bond. The surgical center where he had worked was forced to close its doors. Federal prosecutors charged Ortiz with tampering with a consumer product, causing death and serious bodily injury, as well as intentional drug adulteration. He faced up to life in prison if convicted. The trial began in April 2024 at the Earl Cabell Federal Building in Dallas. Chief U.S. District Judge David Godbey presided over the case. Ortiz pleaded not guilty. His defense team, led by public defender John Nicholson, argued that the prosecution's case was based on confirmation bias. They claimed that investigators only saw what they wanted to see. They suggested that the medical emergencies could have been caused by other factors, like patients' pre-existing conditions or reactions to the medications legitimately given during surgery. They pointed out that the evidence against Ortiz was largely circumstantial. Nobody had actually seen him inject anything into the IV bags. But the prosecution had an overwhelming amount of evidence. They had the surveillance footage showing Ortiz's suspicious behavior around the IV bags. They had forensic analysis proving the bags had been tampered with. They had testimony from medical experts, connecting the symptoms experienced by the victims to the specific drugs found in the contaminated bags. They had the pattern showing that emergencies only occurred after Ortiz had placed bags in the warmer, and that no emergencies occurred when Ortiz was on vacation or not at the facility. The testimony from the victims was devastating. One woman, a 57-year-old from Plano, had gone in for a facelift and liposuction. She expected to go home that day. Instead, she woke up in extreme pain at a different hospital. She was intubated and knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. She spent 4 nights in the ICU. She now has to take beta blockers for the rest of her life. Her facelift was left incomplete because of the emergency, resulting in severe scarring. A 54-year-old woman from McKinney had come in for an abdominoplasty and scar removal from a previous C-section. She underwent a second procedure due to internal bleeding and experienced her cardiac emergency during that second operation. She sobbed on the witness stand as she recalled waking up and thinking she could not die because she had lost a parent as a teenager and could not leave her own daughter without a mother. She spent 5 days in the ICU and was so traumatized that she could not work afterward. Her daughter needed intensive therapy. An elderly man named Jimmy Eller suffered long-term complications including heart problems, kidney stones, and depression. He said his world had been turned upside down. Another victim, named Juan Martinez, said through a translator that the ordeal had turned off his life and he had not been the same person since. The most emotional testimony came from John Casper, the husband of Dr. Melanie Casper. He had watched his wife of 30 years die in front of him. He testified about the horror of seeing her collapse within minutes of attaching that IV bag. He told the jury about her lifeless eyes as they waited for the ambulance that arrived too late. He called her his life and the strongest woman he had ever met. Defense attorneys tried to create doubt about whether Melanie had definitely gotten the bag from the surgical centre, but John was certain. He knew what had happened. His wife was dead because of a poisoned IV bag. On April 12, 2024, after 8 days of trial and about 7 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. They found Reynaldo Rivera Ortiz Jr. guilty on all 10 counts. 4 counts of tampering with consumer products resulting in serious bodily injury, 1 count of tampering with a consumer product, 5 counts of intentional adulteration of a drug. The jurors said they were left with no doubt of his guilt. Some of them were visibly emotional during the trial. The evidence against Ortiz was simply too overwhelming to ignore. Sentencing was originally scheduled for July 2024, but it was delayed multiple times. Finally, on November 20th, 2024, Ortiz faced judgment. He waived his right to be present in the courtroom for sentencing. He chose to sit in another room in the courthouse, out of sight of his victims and their families. 7 people gave victim impact statements that day. Jimmy Eller's letter was read aloud. He described feeling like a prisoner in his own body. Kelly Pfeiffer cried as she spoke about the terrifying experience of being poisoned. Jack Adlerstein's father described the terror of watching his 18-year-old son fight for his life. Juan Martinez said he had wanted to see Ortiz face to face and was upset that the coward was hiding in another room. Nellie Naylor, the first person to experience a cardiac emergency, said she no longer trusted the medical community. A man named Ryan spoke about his father being poisoned. John Casper was the last to speak. He said he would be forever haunted by his wife's eyes. He called Ortiz a coward for not being present and said he killed his wife not with malice, but with sheer calculation. Chief U.S. District Judge David Godbey addressed the victims directly. He told them they had been heard. He spoke about the concept of preparation, noting that Ortiz did not poison all the bags at once, but did so repeatedly over time. This showed a calculated, ongoing intent to harm. The judge found Ortiz responsible for all 11 patient emergencies, not just the 6 included in the federal indictment. Most importantly, the judge specifically found that Ortiz had caused the death of Dr. Melanie Casper, even though he was never formally charged with her murder. The judge described Ortiz's actions as tantamount to attempted murder. Then he handed down the sentence: 2,280 months in federal prison. That is 190 years, the maximum possible sentence for the charges. Ortiz will almost certainly die in prison. U.S. Attorney Leah Simonton released a statement after the sentencing. She compared Ortiz to an armed assailant spraying bullets indiscriminately into a crowd. But she noted that he wielded an invisible weapon, a cocktail of heart-stopping drugs concealed inside an IV bag designed to help patients heal. On at least 9 separate occasions, he essentially attacked unconscious patients lying on an operating table. The victims had no way to defend themselves. They did not even know they were under attack. They trusted the medical system to protect them. They trusted the people in that operating room to keep them safe. And one of those people was deliberately trying to hurt them. Ortiz's defense attorney, John Nicholson, said in a statement that they respectfully disagreed with the jury's verdict and several of the judge's rulings. He said they would invoke Ortiz's right to appeal. But as of now, Ortiz remains in federal custody, facing the rest of his life behind bars. The motive behind these horrifying crimes appears to have been professional jealousy and a desire for revenge. Ortiz was under investigation at the surgical centre for his own medical mistake. He was facing potential loss of his position. Some of the doctors whose patients suffered emergencies were on the board investigating him. Prosecutors argued that Ortiz deliberately sabotaged their surgeries to deflect attention from his own problems. If other doctors were having emergencies too, maybe his own incident would not look so bad. Maybe the facility would blame faulty equipment or contaminated supplies rather than focusing on him. It was a twisted logic born from desperation and malice. The aftermath of the case has raised questions about medical safety that remain unanswered. The IV bags Ortiz tampered with were manufactured by Baxter International. A lawsuit has been filed against the company. arguing that the design of the bags allowed tampering to go undetected. The bags could be injected through a port without leaving any obvious sign of entry. Unlike over-the-counter medications, which had been sold in tamper-evident packaging since the Tylenol poisonings of 1982, IV bags used in medical settings apparently lacked similar protections. As of 2025, there were no new federal regulations regarding IV bag safety. Major hospital systems in the Dallas area have declined to say whether they have changed their protocols because of this case. The surgical center involved has since resumed operations after determining the tampering was limited to one individual. John Casper, Melanie's widower, said after the sentencing that he would probably never spend another minute thinking about Ortiz. That day marked the end of a beautiful part of his life. The next day, he would step in a different direction. His wife was gone. No sentence could bring her back, but at least justice had been served. Roxanne Bogdan, the neighbour whose dog Ortiz had shot years earlier, was present during the trial. She had once considered Ortiz a friend. She had tried to get him help for his behaviour over the years. After the verdict, she said that today was justice and that he was going away forever where he belonged. He could not hurt anybody else anymore. She felt terrible that they had not been able to stop him earlier. She prayed for Melanie's family. Doctor. Melanie Caspar was a great person and a great doctor. She devoted her career to helping patients through surgery safely. She died doing what she had done countless times before, using an IV to treat dehydration. She had no reason to suspect that the bag she brought home was any different from the thousands of other bags she had used throughout her career. She trusted the medical system she had served for decades. That trust was betrayed by a colleague who had sworn the same oath she had. First, do no harm. Ortiz violated that oath in the most fundamental way possible. He used his medical knowledge and his access to medical supplies to deliberately hurt people. He assembled what prosecutors called ticking time bombs and sat back to watch as they went off one by one. He watched emergency responders rush to save the people he had poisoned. He let an 18-year-old boy nearly die on the operating table. He caused 54-year-old mothers to wake up in ICUs, wondering if they would ever see their children again. And he killed a fellow doctor who thought she was simply treating herself for dehydration. The case of Dr. Ronaldo Rivera Ortiz Jr. stands as one of the most disturbing examples of a healthcare professional betraying the trust placed in them. He was given countless opportunities throughout his career, despite warning signs that should have stopped him. Domestic violence arrests, an animal cruelty conviction, patient care failures that required emergency intervention. Each time the system allowed him to continue practicing. Each time he was given another chance. And he used those chances to eventually commit crimes that the judge would describe as tantamount to attempted murder. The victims of his poisoning scheme will carry the physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Melanie Caspar will never come home. Her husband will never stop seeing her lifeless eyes, and Ortiz will spend whatever years he has left in a federal prison cell, unable to hurt anyone ever again. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to case number 5. Case number Xu Ying. Lisa Seng was a doctor of osteopathic medicine who ran a small medical clinic in Southern California. She graduated from Michigan State University College of Osteopathic Medicine in 1996 and received her license to practice medicine in 1997. For several years, she worked as a general practitioner, treating patients for ordinary medical conditions. In 2005, she opened her own clinic called Advanced Care AAA Medical in Rowland Heights, a hillside community located east of Los Angeles. Rowland Heights was home to many upper-middle-class and wealthy immigrants from China, Taiwan, and South Korea. The clinic was located in a strip mall on Fullerton Boulevard, a busy street in the area. Seng's husband, who was also a doctor, worked at the same clinic. When Seng first opened her practice, she treated a normal range of patients with typical medical complaints. However, over time, something changed. Her patient population began to shift. Increasingly, young people started showing up at her clinic. Many of them were young white men in their late teens and 20s. They came from all over Southern California and even from out of state. Some drove for hours to reach her strip mall clinic. They paid cash for their visits. They did not have complicated medical histories or documentation of injuries. They simply wanted one thing: prescriptions for powerful, addictive medications. Seng gave them what they wanted. She began writing prescriptions at an alarming rate. Over a 3-year period starting in January 2007, she wrote more than 27,000 prescriptions for controlled substances. She saw patients at a rate of about 25 per day. The drugs she prescribed most frequently were among the most abused medications in America. Oxycodone, sold under brand names like OxyContin and Percocet. Hydrocodone, popularly known as Vicodin. Alprazolam, better known as Xanax. Carisoprodol, sold as Soma. And amphetamine and dextroamphetamine, sold as Adderall. She also prescribed methadone and other powerful opioids. These drugs had legitimate medical uses, but they were also highly addictive and frequently abused by people seeking to get high. The combination of drugs Tseng prescribed was particularly dangerous. She routinely gave patients prescriptions for an opioid painkiller, a benzodiazepine like Xanax, and a muscle relaxant like Soma, all at the same time. People who abuse drugs have a name for this combination. They call it the Holy Trinity. The reason they seek it out is that the 3 drugs work together to produce an intense high. But the combination is also extremely dangerous. All 3 types of drugs depress the central nervous system. When taken together, they can slow breathing to a dangerous degree. A person can simply stop breathing and die. Medical guidelines strongly recommend against prescribing these 3 types of medications together, unless absolutely necessary and with careful monitoring. Tseng prescribed them together routinely, to patient after patient, visit after visit. The way Tseng ran her practice raised red flags throughout the medical community. Pharmacists began to notice something strange about the prescriptions coming from her clinic. Young, healthy-looking people were showing up to fill expensive brand-name prescriptions for powerful painkillers. The patients were paying cash. They were getting hundreds of pills at a time. The pharmacists became alarmed. Some of them reported their concerns to authorities. This was one of the first signs that something was seriously wrong at the Advanced Care AAA medical clinic in Rowland Heights. The patients who visited Tseng's clinic were not typical people seeking legitimate medical care. Many of them were drug addicts looking for an easy way to obtain pills. Word had spread that Tseng was what addicts called a soft touch. She did not ask many questions. She did not require X-rays or blood tests or other documentation. She did not demand proof of medical conditions that would justify prescribing powerful, controlled substances. Patients could walk in, claim to have back pain or anxiety or some other complaint, and walk out minutes later with prescriptions for hundreds of pills. Some patients coached their friends on what to say to get the prescriptions they wanted. Some shared information online about how easy it was to get drugs from Tseng's clinic. The first patient death connected to Tseng's prescribing practices occurred in September 2007. Matthew Stavron was a young man from San Clemente, California, who had dreams of becoming a professional motocross racer. Like many extreme sports athletes, he had suffered injuries over the years. He had developed a dependence on pain medication. He had gone through a rehabilitation program and was doing better. Then, in September 2007, he visited Tseng's clinic. He made a 2-hour round trip from his parents' home to reach the strip mall office in Rowland Heights. Less than 36 hours after that visit, Matthew Stavron was dead. His mother found him on the bathroom floor, lying in the fetal position, surrounded by pills. He had received prescriptions from Tseng for OxyContin, Soma, and Xanax, the Holy Trinity combination. He was 24 years old. What Tseng did after Matthew Stavron's death would later become crucial evidence against her. The coroner's office called her to notify her that one of her patients had died of a drug overdose from medications she had prescribed. For most doctors, receiving such a call would be deeply troubling. It would prompt soul-searching, careful review of their prescribing practices, and perhaps changes in how they treated patients. But according to testimony from her husband at trial, Tseng regarded these calls as just FYI notices. She did not perceive them as a problem. She did not change her prescribing practices at all. More deaths followed. In 2008, another young man named Ryan Latham died of an overdose after receiving prescriptions from Tseng. She had prescribed him Norco, a powerful opioid painkiller, along with other drugs. 2 days after she wrote the prescription, Ryan Latham was dead. The coroner's office called Tseng to inform her. During the call, she described the patient as a drug seeker. She acknowledged that he was taking large amounts of the medication, yet she had prescribed it to him anyway. She did not change her practices. Later in 2008, on September 20th, a man named Nathan Kenny died of an overdose. He had received prescriptions from Tseng for OxyContin and methadone. There was no indication in his medical records that he had broken bones or cancer or any other condition that would justify such powerful medications. 4 days after filling the prescriptions Tseng had written, Kenny was dead. The coroner's office called Tseng once again. By this point, she had been notified of at least 3 patient deaths. 3 young men had died after taking medications she prescribed. Any reasonable doctor would have been horrified. Any reasonable doctor would have completely re-evaluated their approach to prescribing controlled substances. Tseng did not. The year 2009 brought more tragedy. The 3 deaths that would eventually form the basis of murder charges against Tseng all occurred during this year. The first victim was Vu Nguyen, a 28-year-old man from Lake Forest, California. Nguyen worked as an assistant in clinical trials. He first visited Tseng's clinic in August 2008. His family did not believe he suffered from any medical condition that required him to take painkillers. Over the following months, Tseng prescribed him increasingly powerful combinations of drugs. She gave him Vicodin, then stronger medications like Opana, an opioid even more potent than morphine. She prescribed Xanax and Adderall as well. When Nguyen returned and said the Vicodin was not strong enough, she gave him Norco, a more powerful formulation of hydrocodone. She continued refilling his prescriptions for opioids and sedatives without apparent concern. On March 2, 2009, Vu Nguyen died. The Orange County Coroner's Division conducted an autopsy and determined that the cause of death was the combined effects of Opana and Xanax. He also had methadone in his system. All of these drugs had been prescribed by Tseng. The coroner's office called Tseng to discuss Nguyen's death. During the conversation, she told the investigator that Nguyen was always seeking more drugs. She characterized him as a drug seeker, yet she had continued prescribing to him anyway, even increasing the strength of the medications she provided when he complained the drugs were not strong enough. By this point, Tseng had been notified of at least 4 patient deaths. Her prescribing practices remained unchanged. Just over a month later, on April 9, 2009, another of Tseng's patients died. Stephen Ogle was 24 years old and lived in Palm Desert, California. He had become addicted to prescription drugs and was struggling. His family was desperate to help him. They reached out to Tseng directly. Family members called her office and pleaded with her not to prescribe drugs to their loved one. They begged her not to see him as a patient. They explained that he had a serious addiction problem and that her prescriptions were making things worse. Tseng ignored their pleas. She continued to see Stephen Ogle as a patient. She continued to prescribe him dangerous combinations of medications. Tseng was not qualified to treat addiction. She was not a pain management specialist. She was an osteopathic doctor whose training emphasized holistic healing. She had no special expertise in the complex medical management of patients with chronic pain or substance abuse disorders. Yet she prescribed methadone to Stephen Ogle. Methadone is a powerful synthetic opioid that is used both for pain management and to treat opioid addiction. Its use requires careful medical supervision because of its unique properties and the serious risks of overdose. Tseng was not licensed to prescribe and monitor methadone for addiction treatment. She prescribed it anyway, along with OxyContin and other drugs. Stephen Ogle died of an overdose. The coroner's office called Tseng once again to notify her. The final death that would lead to murder charges occurred on December 18, 2009. Joseph Rivero III was just 21 years old. He was a student at Arizona State University, but he came from a family in San Ramon, California. Joey, as his family called him, had traveled from Arizona to visit Tseng's clinic. He used his parents' California address rather than his Arizona address. He was coached by a friend on what to say to obtain prescription drugs. He walked into the clinic, claimed to have pain, and walked out with prescriptions for the Holy Trinity combination. 9 days after visiting Tseng's office, Joey Rivero was dead. Joey's mother, April Rivero, had been expecting her son home from college for winter break. Instead of welcoming him back and enjoying the holidays together, she learnt that her son was dead. Instead of celebrating Christmas, the family was writing an obituary. Instead of wrapping presents, they were picking out a casket and a gravesite. Joey Rivero was buried the day after Christmas. By the end of 2009, at least 6 of Tseng's patients had died of drug overdoses. 3 more would die before authorities finally shut down her operation. The total number of patient deaths connected to her prescribing practices would eventually reach at least 12. During the years when her patients were dying, Between 2007 and 2010, Tseng's clinic took in approximately $5 million. The money came from the cash payments of the patients she saw at a rate of 25 per day. She was making more than $3,000 per day while young people were dying from the drugs she prescribed. The investigation into Tseng began after pharmacists reported their concerns about her prescriptions. The Drug Enforcement Administration and the California Medical Board opened a joint investigation. Starting in April 2008, authorities sent undercover investigators to Tseng's clinic. Over a period of 6 months, 10 different undercover agents visited her office, posing as patients seeking drugs. The agents asked for prescription medications. During each visit, Tseng provided what they asked for without conducting meaningful medical examinations, taking proper medical histories, or questioning whether the drugs were truly necessary. The undercover visits revealed how Tseng ran her practice. The appointments were shockingly brief. Some lasted barely minutes. The doctor did not perform physical examinations. She did not take detailed medical histories. She did not require documentation of medical conditions that might justify prescribing controlled substances. She simply wrote prescriptions for whatever the supposed patients requested. The undercover agents walked away with prescriptions for Vicodin, Suboxone, Xanax, and other controlled substances. The evidence gathered during these visits would prove crucial in the eventual prosecution. In August 2010, the DEA executed a federal search warrant at Tseng's Rowland Heights clinic. Agents seized patient records and other documentation. At the same time, the DEA served an immediate suspension order on Tseng's certificate of registration. This meant she could no longer legally prescribe controlled substances. Investigators had determined that her continued ability to prescribe medications constituted an imminent danger to public health and safety. The suspension effectively shut down the drug prescribing operation that had been running out of the strip mall clinic. The investigation revealed disturbing details about how Tseng kept records. In many cases, she kept no records at all. Dozens of patient visits occurred without any documentation. When she did keep records, they were often incomplete or fabricated. When authorities began investigating, she created fake records to try to justify the prescriptions she had written. The evidence showed that she had altered patient records while she was under investigation. Prosecutors would later tell jurors that the records were manufactured by the defendant at a later date, in an effort to cover up her misdeeds. The investigation also revealed that Tseng knew exactly what she was doing. She openly referred to some of her patients as druggies. In one instance, she wrote a man's name on prescriptions so his wife could get twice as many pills. This allowed the woman to double dip on her prescriptions, obtaining up to 400 pills per week. Tseng told an undercover DEA agent that Norco, one of the opioid painkillers she frequently prescribed, was addictive and evil. Yet she continued prescribing it and other dangerous drugs to patients who showed clear signs of addiction. On March 2, 2012, front pages of newspapers in the Los Angeles area carried a shocking headline. A Rowland Heights doctor was facing murder charges for prescription drugs. Xu-Ying Lisa Tseng had been arrested and charged with 3 counts of second-degree murder for the deaths of Vu Nguyen, Stephen Ogle, and Joseph Rivero. She also faced more than 20 additional felony counts related to illegal prescribing and fraud. 4 of those counts involved the undercover DEA agents who had visited her clinic. The charges alleged that she had prescribed drugs using fraud and without a legitimate medical purpose. Tseng was held on $3 million bail. At the time of her arrest, she was 42 years old. She was married with 2 young children, a daughter and a son, who were around 8 and 10 years old. She had been affiliated with 14 hospitals in the greater Los Angeles area. Almost all of those hospitals had ranked her in the top 25% of physicians. This was one of the puzzling aspects of the case. How could a doctor who was so highly rated by hospitals be running what amounted to a pill mill on the side? The Osteopathic Medical Board of California took action against Tseng's license. She voluntarily surrendered her medical license in 2012 following her arrest. She would never practice medicine again. Her husband, who had worked at the same clinic, continued to run the practice. He was not charged with any crimes. Tseng remained in custody from March 2012 through her trial and sentencing. She did not make bail. The case took years to work its way through the court system. Civil lawsuits were filed by families of the deceased. At least 8 Orange County families sued Tseng over the deaths of their loved ones. Before the criminal trial, Tseng agreed to pay settlements in some of those cases, including $225,000 to the family of Nicholas Matter, a 22-year-old from Huntington Beach, who died of an overdose. The criminal trial began in September 2015 in Los Angeles Superior Court. It was a landmark case. Tseng was the first doctor in California to be charged with murder for the deaths of patients to whom she had prescribed drugs. Deputy District Attorneys John Niederman and Grace Rye of the Major Narcotics Division handled the prosecution. Defense attorney Tracy Green represented Tseng. The prosecution's case was built on overwhelming evidence. Prosecutors told the jury about the 9 overdose deaths associated with Tseng's practice in less than 3 years. They detailed how she had been repeatedly warned that her patients were dying and had failed to change her practices. They presented evidence from the undercover investigations showing how easily she prescribes dangerous drugs without proper medical justification. They called expert witnesses who testified that Tseng's treatment of her patients was well below the standard of care in the practice of medicine. The prosecution focused on the 3 deaths for which Tseng was charged with murder. Prosecutors explained that these 3 cases were chosen because they were the strongest. In the other patient deaths, there were complicating factors such as drugs prescribed by other doctors, possible suicide, or other circumstances that made it harder to prove Tseng's prescriptions were the direct cause of death. But in the cases of Vu Nguyen, Stephen Ogle, and Joseph Rivero, the evidence clearly showed that Tseng's prescriptions had killed them. Deputy District Attorney Niederman delivered a powerful closing argument. He told the jury that Tseng had been warned again and again and again. "They're dying, they're dying, they're dying," he said. "She understands what she's doing, the harm of it, and she does it anyway." He explained that Tseng had received calls from coroner's officials about the deaths. She had received calls from family members begging her to stop prescribing to their loved ones. She had known that her patients were drug seekers, that they were becoming addicted, that they were dying, and she had done nothing to stop it. The defense tried to shift blame away from Tseng. Attorney Tracy Green argued that other factors contributed to the deaths. The prescriptions were filled by pharmacies, some patients were seeing other doctors as well. The patients themselves took far in excess of the dosages prescribed. They mixed the medications with alcohol or other drugs not prescribed by Tseng. The defense painted Tseng as a naive doctor who trusted her patients too much, not a murderer. She was a soft-hearted doctor, Green said, who was taken advantage of by manipulative drug seekers. Green told the jury that the patients had contacted Tseng, presented themselves as pain patients with injuries, and sought prescription medications. They had feigned illnesses and lied to her. They had driven from far away and used false addresses. They had learned how to manipulate the system. Lisa Tseng happened to be the last stop for men who had struggled for many years, Green said. She acted as a doctor, not a drug dealer. The jury did not buy the defense arguments. On October 30th, 2015, after a 6-week trial, a jury of 10 women and 2 men returned their verdict. They found Xu Ying Lisa Tseng guilty on 23 counts. She was convicted of 3 counts of second-degree murder for the deaths of Vu Nguyen, Stephen Ogle, and Joseph Rivero. She was also convicted of 19 counts of unlawful controlled substance prescription and 1 count of obtaining a controlled substance by fraud. She was acquitted on only 1 of the drug-related counts. The guilty verdict was historic. For the first time in the United States, a doctor had been convicted of murder for over-prescribing drugs. The District Attorney of Los Angeles County, Jackie Lacey, issued a statement praising the verdict. "This verdict sends a strong message to individuals in the medical community who put patients at risk for their own financial gain," Lacey said. In this case, the doctor stole the lives of 3 young people in her misguided effort to get rich quick. The DEA also issued a statement. Lisa Tseng's conviction should send a message to doctors who violate the public's trust and engage in what is effectively drug trafficking, said the special agent in charge of the DEA's Los Angeles Field Division. Families of the victims were given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing. On December 14, 2015, mothers, fathers, brothers, aunts, and other relatives stood before the judge and delivered tearful statements about the lives that had been lost. Verlene Crawford, the mother of Nathan Kenny, who had died in 2008, confronted Tseng directly. "During which office visit did you no longer see my son as a person and only as a deposit into your bank account?" she asked. "Did you ever look in the mirror and were sickened by what you saw?" Crawford told Tseng that if she truly believed she was not guilty, she would be able to look the family members straight in the eyes. "God help you," she said. Ryan Latham's father told Tseng that her responsibility was the same as if you had held a loaded gun and pulled the trigger. "You've earned it," he said of the prison sentence that was coming. Other family members shared memories of the loved ones they had lost. They spoke of young men with dreams and potential whose lives had been cut short. They described the devastating impact of losing a child, a sibling, a loved one to an overdose. Throughout the statements, Tseng sat quietly in her blue jail uniform. She showed no visible emotion as the families confronted her. This lack of reaction angered many of the victims' families. They wanted to see remorse. They wanted some acknowledgement of the pain she had caused. The sentencing hearing took place on February 5, 2016, at the Clara Shortridge Foltz Criminal Justice Center in downtown Los Angeles. The courtroom was packed with family members of the victims. Tseng, now 46 years old, appeared in a blue Los Angeles County Jail jumpsuit. Before the judge pronounced sentence, Tseng was given the opportunity to speak. In a soft voice, Tseng apologized. "I cannot imagine what you have gone through," she said to the families. "I have been, and will forever be, praying for all of you." She said she suffered every day from the impact of what had happened and would do everything she could to take responsibility. "I have learned a very hard lesson on this that will stay with me forever," she said. "No words can really properly describe the sadness and remorse that I feel. It is very tragic for anyone who suffered such great loss, but most especially tragic for those who lost their children and their siblings. I know I cannot turn back the clock." In a letter submitted to the judge before sentencing, Tseng had written more extensively about her feelings. She said she wanted the court to understand how shameful and remorseful she felt for having broken all the professional rules and standards while practicing medicine. She acknowledged that her treatment and prescriptions had been part of her patients' addictions. She said she realised she had been in denial over her prescribing practices and their effects. She admitted that she was not properly trained in addiction medicine or pain management. She mentioned personal problems that had interfered with her abilities, including undiagnosed depression, hoarding, and difficulty juggling work and children. Superior Court Judge George G. Lamelli was not swayed by the apology. Before pronouncing sentence, he delivered remarks about the case. He said it was egregious that Tseng, a highly educated physician, had continued her prescribing practices after receiving ample warnings about the deaths of patients she had treated. He noted that even at the sentencing hearing, the defense was trying to shift blame to others, including the patients themselves, other doctors, and the pharmacists who had filled the prescriptions. The judge called this approach very irresponsible. Judge Lamelli said that Tseng was responsible, in part, no matter what she may state, for the tragic deaths of 3 men. He called her conduct reckless. He noted that she had put the blame on someone else, rather than taking true responsibility for her actions. Then he pronounced the sentence: 30 years to life in state prison. The sentence was structured as follows. For each of the 3 murder convictions, Tseng received a sentence of 15 years to life. But because the deaths were treated as separate acts, the sentences for 2 of the murders were ordered to run consecutively. This meant she would have to serve at least 30 years before becoming eligible for parole. She also received a concurrent sentence for the controlled substance conviction. As the sentence was read, Tseng showed no emotion. She would not be eligible for parole until she had served 30 years. Given that she was 46 years old at sentencing, this meant she would be at least 76 years old before she could even be considered for release. District Attorney Jackie Lacey issued a statement after the sentencing. "This is the most severe penalty we have ever gotten on a doctor who illegally overprescribed drugs to patients," she said. The conviction sent a strong message to others in the medical profession that putting patients at risk for financial gain could result in the most serious criminal consequences. Jerry Rovero's mother, April, had become an advocate for prescription drug safety after her son's death. She formed a national coalition against prescription drug abuse. After the sentencing, she spoke to reporters outside the courthouse. "Our family feels that justice has been done," she said. "We are very satisfied with the sentence." She recalled that her son had gone to see Tseng and was dead 9 days later. "We would never have guessed this would happen to Joey or our family. And yet here we are in this very high-profile case that has gotten really international attention. So it is surreal," she said. "We are really glad to put this behind us." Tseng's mother was also at the courthouse. Speaking through an interpreter, she said she felt the sentence was not fair. "My heart is broken," she said. Defense attorney Tracy Green announced that Tseng intended to appeal both her conviction and her sentence. The appeal process would take years. In December 2018, More than 2 years after the sentencing, the California Court of Appeal issued a 45-page ruling. A 3-justice panel unanimously upheld the conviction. The court found that there was overwhelming evidence of Tseng's knowledge of risk and reckless indifference to her patients' lives in her prescribing practices. The ruling stated that the record disclosed overwhelming evidence that Tseng's treatment of Nguyen, Ogle, Rivero, and other patients was well below the standard of care in the practice of medicine and prescribing opioid medications. As a licensed physician, the court noted, Tseng had expert knowledge of the life-threatening risk posed by her drug prescribing practice. The appellate court also rejected the defense argument that the jury should not have been allowed to hear about the deaths of 6 other patients for whom Tseng was not charged. The court found that evidence of those deaths helped the jury assess Tseng's level of awareness of the risk in determining whether she had acted with conscious disregard for human life at the time of the murders. The court noted that Tseng was aware of the overdose deaths of 2 earlier patients before she even started treating Vu Nguyen, and that she learned of the death of a 3rd patient while she was treating him. California Attorney General Javier Becerra issued a statement celebrating the appellate victory. "Every day the opioid crisis destroys lives and communities," he said. "It spares no one. Doctors like Xu Ying Tseng, who engage in reckless practices when prescribing drugs that lead to addiction, overdose, and in this case, death, must be held accountable." The Attorney General's office noted that the published ruling recognized that a medical professional who knowingly and recklessly prescribes potentially deadly drugs to vulnerable patients in increasing doses and with utter disregard for their welfare has committed murder. Tseng continued to pursue appeals. Her lawyers asked the California Supreme Court to review the case. In March 2019, the state's highest court refused to revisit the case. The conviction and 30-year-to-life sentence would stand. The case of Lisa Tseng became a landmark in American legal history. For the first time, a doctor had been convicted of murder, not manslaughter, for prescribing drugs that led to patient deaths. The case sent ripples through the medical community. Some physicians worried that they could face criminal prosecution for prescribing opioids to patients in legitimate pain. Medical experts rushed to reassure doctors that the Tseng case was an extreme outlier. Her practices had been so far outside the standard of care, so obviously dangerous, that reasonable physicians had nothing to fear. The Tseng case also highlighted the devastating toll of the opioid epidemic that was sweeping America. At the time of her sentencing in 2016, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported that prescription opioid overdoses were killing nearly 17,000 Americans every year. The epidemic was also fueling a rise in heroin addiction, as people who became addicted to prescription pills turned to cheaper street drugs when they could no longer afford or obtain pills. Medical experts and law enforcement officials pointed to reckless and criminal prescribing by doctors like Tseng as a major contributor to the crisis. The young men who died because of Tseng's prescriptions were not unusual. They were representative of a generation devastated by opioid addiction. They were sons and brothers and friends. They had dreams and potential. Matthew Stavron wanted to be a professional motocross racer. Joey Rivero was a college student with his whole life ahead of him. Stephen Ogle was someone whose family loved him so much they begged his doctor to stop enabling his addiction. Vu Nguyen had a job working in clinical trials, helping to advance medical research. Ryan Latham and Nathan Kenny were young men whose deaths barely made the news until a prosecutor decided to hold their doctor accountable. The victims' families found different ways to cope with their losses. Some, like April Rivero, channeled their grief into advocacy. Others simply tried to move forward with their lives while carrying the weight of their loss. All of them had to live with the knowledge that their loved ones might still be alive if a doctor had simply done her job properly. If Tseng had followed basic medical guidelines, had conducted proper examinations, had questioned whether her patients truly needed dangerous drugs, had listened to the warnings from coroners and family members, these young men might have had a chance to overcome their addictions and live full lives. Lisa Tseng sits in prison today, serving her 30-year-to-life sentence. She will not be eligible for parole until 2042 at the earliest. By then, she will be in her 70s. The clinic where she prescribed drugs to so many patients who would later die is still there in the strip mall in Rowland Heights. Her husband continued to operate it after her arrest. The community around it has moved on, but the families of the young men who died carry their losses forever. The case established an important legal precedent. Doctors who recklessly prescribe drugs that kill their patients can be charged with murder. The conviction requires proof that the doctor knew the risks and consciously disregarded them. It requires evidence of a pattern of dangerous prescribing that continued even after warnings. It requires showing that the doctor prioritized something, whether money or convenience or simple negligence, over the lives of their patients. Lisa Seng met all of those criteria. Her conviction stands as a warning to other doctors who might be tempted to run pill mills or to prescribe powerful medications without proper medical justification. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the final case of the video, case number 6. Jack Kevorkian was born on May 26, 1928, in Pontiac, Michigan. His birth name was Murad Jacob Kevorkian, though he would later become known simply as Jack, after American friends and teachers gave him that nickname during his school years. He was the second of 3 children born to Levon and Satanig Kevorkian, both Armenian immigrants who had fled their homeland under the most horrific circumstances imaginable. His father, Levon, was born in 1891 in the village of Pasan near Erzurum in what was then the Ottoman Empire. His mother, Satanig, was born in 1900 in the village of Govdon near Sivas. Both villages were located in areas that would become part of modern-day Turkey. Levon left Ottoman Armenia in 1912, smuggled out by missionaries, and eventually made his way to Pontiac, Michigan, where he found work at an automobile foundry. Satanig's journey was even more traumatic. She fled the Armenian genocide of 1915, during which approximately 1.5 million Armenians were systematically killed by the Ottoman Turkish government. She found refuge with relatives in Paris, before eventually reuniting with her brother in Pontiac. It was through the Armenian community in Pontiac that Levon and Satanig met, married, and started their family. They had 3 children together, a daughter named Margaret, born in 1926, followed by Murad in 1928, and finally a daughter named Flora. The Kevorkian family lived in a working-class neighborhood in Pontiac that was home to many immigrant families from Armenia, Greece, and Bulgaria. When Levon lost his job at the automobile foundry during the Great Depression in the early 1930s, he found work with a contractor and eventually started his own excavating company, which became quite successful. The family moved to a more comfortable home, and despite the hardships of the Depression era, the Kevorkian children never went without food or basic necessities. Levon and Satanig were strict and deeply religious parents who raised their children in the Armenian Orthodox faith. They attended church weekly, and young Jack was sent to Sunday school like his siblings. But Jack was different from the other children. He was an extremely bright child who questioned everything. He found himself unable to accept the religious teachings he was given. If there was an all-knowing, all-powerful God, Jack reasoned, then surely that God would have prevented the slaughter of his mother's entire extended family and the near destruction of the Armenian people. He could not reconcile the idea of a benevolent deity with the horrors his parents had witnessed and survived. By the age of 12, Jack had stopped attending church entirely. This early rejection of organized religion would shape his worldview for the rest of his life. Jack was what many would call a child prodigy. He was an exceptionally gifted student who taught himself multiple foreign languages, including German, Russian, Greek, and Japanese. He was also an avid reader who devoured books on every subject imaginable. His intellectual abilities set him apart from his peers, but not always in positive ways. Other children found him strange and difficult to relate to. He had few close friends growing up, and often felt isolated and alienated. He was described by those who knew him as warm-hearted, but very much a loner. Despite his social difficulties, Jack excelled academically. He graduated from Pontiac Central High School with honours in 1945 at the age of just 17. He enrolled at the University of Michigan, initially planning to study engineering, but halfway through his freshman year, he became bored with the subject and began focusing instead on botany and biology. By the middle of the year, he had set his sights on medical school. He took heavy course loads, sometimes up to 20 credit hours per semester, to meet the requirements for admission. His hard work paid off. In 1952, at the age of 24, Jack Kevorkian graduated from the University of Michigan Medical School in Ann Arbor with a specialization in pathology. Pathology is the branch of medicine that deals with the study of disease, particularly through examination of organs, tissues, and bodily fluids. Pathologists often work in laboratories and morgues rather than directly with living patients. They perform autopsies to determine causes of death and analyze tissue samples to diagnose diseases. It was during his medical training that Kevorkian first developed what would become a lifelong fascination with death and dying. He completed his internship at Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit, where he had an experience that would profoundly affect him. He witnessed a middle-aged woman dying of cancer. The look in her eyes, the suffering etched on her face, stayed with him. He began to think about the nature of death and whether there might be ways to make the dying process less painful and more dignified. In 1953, Kevorkian's medical career was interrupted when he was called to serve as a medical officer during the Korean War. After his discharge, he returned to Michigan and took positions at several hospitals, including Pontiac General Hospital, where he would work for many years. It was at Pontiac General that Kevorkian began conducting the kind of unconventional research that would earn him his first nickname, Dr. Death. In 1956, he published a journal article describing his efforts to photograph the eyes of dying patients at the exact moment of death. He believed that studying the changes in the eyes could help physicians more precisely determine the time of death and distinguish between true death and deep coma. The research was considered macabre by many of his colleagues, but Kevorkian saw it as valuable scientific inquiry. He continued pursuing controversial ideas throughout the 1950s. In 1958, he presented a paper at a medical conference in Washington, D.C., proposing that condemned prisoners on death row should be given the option to undergo medical experimentation under anesthesia instead of being executed by traditional methods. He argued that this would allow valuable medical knowledge to be gained from their deaths. The proposal was considered outrageous by the medical establishment. Officials at the University of Michigan, where Kevorkian was completing a residency, were so embarrassed that they asked him to leave. Kevorkian's interest in death-related research did not diminish. In 1961, he published an article detailing his experiments with transfusing blood from corpses into living patients. The research was actually quite successful from a scientific standpoint, and Kevorkian believed the technique could be useful on battlefields where blood supplies were limited. He pitched the idea to the Pentagon, thinking it could help save the lives of soldiers wounded in Vietnam. But the military showed no interest. Throughout the 1960s, Kevorkian continued working as a pathologist at various hospitals, while pursuing his unconventional ideas on the side. He served as chief of pathology at Saratoga General Hospital in Detroit and worked at several hospitals in the Los Angeles area. He never married, explaining that he viewed romantic relationships as unnecessary distractions from his work. He remained a bachelor his entire life. By the 1970s, Kevorkian had grown frustrated with conventional medicine. He quit his pathology career and moved to Long Beach, California, where he spent 12 years pursuing artistic interests. He was a talented painter whose works tended toward the dark, grotesque, and surreal. His paintings depicted scenes of death, suffering, and human mortality, with titles that reflected his preoccupation with life's end. He was also a musician who played the flute, organ, and keyboard, composing pieces heavily influenced by his musical idol, Johann Sebastian Bach. During this period, he invested his life savings in directing and producing a feature film based on Handel's Messiah, but the project was unsuccessful. In 1985, Kevorkian returned to Michigan, moving into a small apartment in Royal Oak. He was 57 years old and had spent decades thinking about death, dying, and the suffering of terminally ill patients. He was about to embark on the chapter of his life that would make him famous. In 1986, Kevorkian learned that doctors in the Netherlands had begun helping terminally ill patients die through lethal injection without facing legal consequences. Intrigued, he travelled to the Netherlands in 1987 to study the techniques being used by Dutch physicians. What he saw convinced him that physician-assisted suicide could be a humane option for people suffering from terminal illnesses. He returned to Michigan and began writing articles about what he called medicide, his term for physician-assisted suicide. He also began advertising in Detroit area newspapers, offering his services as a physician consultant for death counseling. He proposed establishing what he called obitoriums, facilities where doctors could help terminally ill patients end their lives in a controlled medical setting. The idea attracted enormous media attention, most of it negative. The medical establishment was horrified. But Kevorkian also began receiving letters from desperate people suffering from incurable diseases who wanted his help to die. To facilitate assisted suicide, Kevorkian designed and built a device he called the Thanatron, a name derived from the Greek word for death. The machine cost only about $45 to construct from easily available materials. It consisted of an intravenous line connected to 3 bottles that would deliver successive doses of fluids. First came a harmless saline solution. Then, when the patient was ready, they would press a button that would switch the drip to thiopental, a powerful sedative that would put them into a deep sleep within seconds. Finally, after about a minute, the machine would automatically deliver a lethal dose of potassium chloride, which would stop the heart. The entire process was designed so that the patient would be the one to initiate the lethal sequence. Kevorkian would set everything up and attach the patient to the machine, but the patient would press the button that actually started the flow of deadly drugs. This distinction would prove crucial in later legal proceedings. On June 4, 1990, Kevorkian used his Thanatron for the first time. His patient was Janet Adkins, a 54-year-old woman from Portland, Oregon, who had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Adkins was a member of the Hemlock Society, a national organization that advocated for the right of terminally ill people to choose death. She had read about Kevorkian in the newspaper and contacted him, asking for his help to end her life before her mental faculties deteriorated completely. Kevorkian agreed to help her. The death took place in the back of Kevorkian's Volkswagen van, which was parked in a public campground in Oakland County, Michigan. Janet Adkins pressed the button that released the lethal drugs into her system and died within minutes. The case immediately made national headlines. Here was a doctor who had openly helped a patient kill herself and then announced what he had done to the world. The state of Michigan charged Kevorkian with murder, but the charges were dismissed when a judge ruled that Michigan had no law specifically prohibiting assisted suicide. However, a judge did issue an injunction ordering Kevorkian to stop using his machine. Kevorkian ignored the injunction. Over the following months and years, he continued helping people die. When his medical license was revoked by the state of Michigan in 1991, he simply continued without it. He developed a second device, which he called the Mercitron, that used carbon monoxide instead of injected drugs. Patients would put on a gas mask connected to a canister of carbon monoxide and breathe in the deadly gas until they lost consciousness and died. Between 1990 and 1998, according to his own accounts and those of his lawyer Jeffrey Feiger, Kevorkian assisted in the deaths of approximately 130 people. Most were suffering from terminal illnesses like cancer or Lou Gehrig's disease. Some had chronic but not necessarily terminal conditions. A few, critics pointed out, had conditions that were treatable or were suffering primarily from depression rather than physical illness. Autopsy reports on some of Kevorkian's patients showed no evidence of serious disease at all. The authorities repeatedly tried to stop him. Kevorkian was charged with murder or assisted suicide multiple times, but Michigan juries refused to convict him. He went to trial 4 times between 1994 and 1997. The first 3 trials ended in acquittal, and the 4th ended in a mistrial. The juries heard emotional testimony from the families of the deceased, who described the terrible suffering their loved ones had endured and their gratitude to Kevorkian for providing relief. Defense attorney Jeffrey Feiger proved masterful at portraying Kevorkian as a compassionate doctor helping the suffering, rather than a killer taking lives. Each acquittal emboldened Kevorkian further. He became a celebrity, appearing on television talk shows and granting interviews to major newspapers and magazines. Time magazine put him on its cover in 1993, dubbing him Dr. Death. To his supporters, he was a hero fighting for the rights of the dying. To his critics, he was a dangerous zealot who had appointed himself judge of who should live and who should die. In September 1998, Kevorkian made a decision that would finally bring his activities to an end. He was 70 years old and had been assisting suicides for 8 years without ever being successfully prosecuted. He had evaded conviction because in every case, it was the patient who had pushed the button or put on the gas mask. Kevorkian had set up the equipment and been present during the deaths, but the final act had always been performed by the patient themselves. This gave his lawyers the ability to argue that the deaths were suicides, not murders. But Kevorkian was not content with assisted suicide anymore. He wanted to force a public reckoning on the larger issue of euthanasia, the practice of a doctor directly ending a patient's life. To do this, he needed a case where he himself administered the lethal drugs. He needed to be charged with murder, tried, and ideally acquitted, so that the courts and the public would be forced to debate whether mercy killing should be legal. Thomas Uke was the man who had become Kevorkian's final case. Uke was born on March 4, 1946, which made him 52 years old in 1998. He had lived an active life. He restored and raced vintage automobiles and had been a champion on the Ohio Valley racing circuit. He was married to a woman named Melody, and he had a close relationship with his mother Betty and his brothers Terence and Bob. In 1996, at the age of 50, Thomas Uke was diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, commonly known as ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease. ALS is a devastating neurological condition that causes the progressive degeneration of the nerve cells that control voluntary muscle movement. There is no cure. The disease gradually robs its victims of the ability to move, speak, swallow, and eventually breathe. The mind typically remains clear throughout, meaning patients are fully aware of what is happening to them as their bodies fail. Most people with ALS die within 3 to 5 years of diagnosis, usually from respiratory failure. By September 1998, Thomas Uke's condition had deteriorated severely. He could no longer move his left arm or his legs. He had only minimal use of his right arm. He could not eat normally and was being fed through a tube inserted into his stomach. He had difficulty breathing and needed a machine to help him. He was choking on his own saliva because he could no longer swallow properly. He told his brother that the pain was like having his body plugged into an electric socket. Morphine did little to help. He could not do anything for himself and was completely dependent on others for every basic need. Tom Uke wanted to die. He had discussed his wishes with his wife, his mother, and his brothers. They all understood. The family contacted Jack Kevorkian, finding his address on the internet and sending him a letter. Kevorkian called back the next day and arranged to visit. On September 15, 1998 at 9:55 in the evening, Jack Kevorkian arrived at Thomas Uke's home in Waterford Township, a suburb of Detroit in Oakland County, Michigan. He brought a video camera and recorded the conversation that followed. On the tape, Kevorkian explained that he was documenting their interaction in connection with a request from Thomas for help in ending his suffering. Uke described his condition in his own words. He explained that his symptoms had first become noticeable in 1994 and that he had been confined to a wheelchair since 1997. He talked about the progression of the disease and the loss of function he had experienced. He stated clearly that he could not do anything for himself and that he had discussed his wishes with his family. They understood why he wanted to end his life. It was his decision. The meeting ended at 10:15 in the evening. Before Kevorkian left, Uke read and agreed to a consent form. The form stated that he, Thomas Uke, entirely voluntarily, without any reservation, external persuasion, pressure, or duress, and after prolonged and thorough deliberation, consented to direct injection, what the form called active euthanasia, to be administered by a competent medical professional in order to end with certainty his intolerable and hopelessly incurable suffering. The following night, September 16, 1998, Kevorkian returned to the Uke home at 9:49 in the evening. Again, he brought his video camera and recorded what happened. Thomas Uke confirmed that he wanted to go through with the procedure. He signed the consent form. Kevorkian explained that he would inject the drugs directly into Uke's vein because it was quicker that way. He attached an electrocardiogram machine to Uke's body so they would know when his heart stopped beating. Then Kevorkian administered the drugs. First came Anectine, a muscle relaxant. Then Seconal, a powerful sedative. Finally, potassium chloride, which stops the heart. Thomas Uke died within minutes. The electrocardiogram showed a flat line. It was over. Police were dispatched to Uke's house at 1:30 in the morning on September 17, 1998. They found Thomas Uke lying dead on his bed. An autopsy was conducted later that morning. The medical examiner found 2 fresh needle marks on Uke's wrists that had been covered with makeup. The official cause of death was listed as poisoning by intravenous injection of substances. The manner of death was ruled homicide. Kevorkian did not try to hide what he had done. He wanted to be prosecuted. He wanted his day in court. He contacted Mike Wallace, the legendary journalist from the CBS News program 60 Minutes, and arranged to have the videotapes of his interactions with Thomas Uke sent to the network. On November 22, 1998, 60 Minutes broadcast the segment to a national audience of millions. Americans watched Jack Kevorkian, on camera, inject lethal drugs into a paralysed man and watch him die. In an interview with Wallace that aired alongside the footage, Kevorkian all but dared prosecutors to come after him. Wallace asked whether what Kevorkian had done could be called murder. Kevorkian replied that it could be called manslaughter, but not necessarily murder. It did not bother him what people called it. He said that what Uke had received was better than an assisted suicide, because there was better control when Kevorkian administered the drugs himself. Wallace asked if the whole thing had been a political, medical, macabre publicity venture. Kevorkian admitted that it probably was. The broadcast caused an immediate uproar. Kevorkian had essentially broadcast a killing on national television and challenged the legal system to do something about it. 3 days later, on November 25, 1998, Oakland County prosecutor David Gorsyka filed charges against Kevorkian. He was charged with first-degree murder, which carried a potential sentence of life in prison. He was also charged with delivery of a controlled substance, since his medical license had been revoked years earlier, and he was not legally allowed to possess or administer the drugs he had used. Additionally, he was charged under Michigan's new assisted suicide law, which had been passed on September 1, 1998, just weeks before Uke's death. The law made assisted suicide a felony, punishable by up to 5 years in prison. Prosecutor Gorsyka was blunt in his assessment. Kevorkian's real purpose had been to terminate Uke's life, and under the law, that constituted criminal intent. The premeditated and deliberate fashion in which he had ended Uke's life clearly fit the definition of murder under Michigan statutes. Kevorkian initially hired lawyers to represent him. David Garrosh and Lisa Dwyer entered their appearances on his behalf. But Kevorkian had other plans. He had come to believe that this case was his opportunity to take the fight for euthanasia all the way to the United States Supreme Court. He talked about being convicted, appealing, and having the High Court rule on whether mercy killing should be legal. He even suggested he might win the Nobel Prize. His fanaticism, some would say, had overwhelmed his common sense. In a major tactical blunder, his defense team filed a motion to dismiss the assisted suicide charge. Their theory was that no jury would ever convict Kevorkian of murder if the only other option was complete acquittal. Without the assisted suicide charge as a middle ground, they believed jurors would choose to let him go free rather than brand him a murderer. Judge Jessica Cooper, who was presiding over the case, warned the defense about the consequences of this strategy. If the assisted suicide charge was dismissed, any evidence about Thomas Yoke's pain and suffering would become legally irrelevant and inadmissible. The case would be solely about whether Kevorkian had intentionally killed a human being, not about why he had done it or whether Uke had consented. The prosecution, seeing the opportunity, moved to dismiss the assisted suicide charge themselves. The trial began on March 22, 1999, in Oakland County Circuit Court. On the second day of proceedings, Jack Kevorkian made a decision that shocked everyone. He informed Judge Cooper that he wished to represent himself for the remainder of the trial. His lawyers would remain present as advisors, but he would conduct his own defense. Judge Cooper questioned him extensively about this decision. She explained that a criminal trial was a formal, complex, and dynamic proceeding with strict rules of evidence and procedure. She warned him that he could spend the rest of his life in prison if convicted of first-degree murder. Kevorkian was undeterred. He told the judge not to agonize over it. He had made his choice and did not blame anyone else. He said he would do the best he could with his advisors present. The judge granted his request to proceed pro se, meaning he would represent himself. Without Jeffrey Feiger, the skilled defense attorney who had won him 3 acquittals and a mistrial, Kevorkian was badly outmatched. The prosecution's case was straightforward and devastating. They showed the jury the 60 minutes broadcast, including the footage of Kevorkian injecting the lethal drugs into Thomas Uke. They called only 3 witnesses: 2 police officers who had responded to the 911 call about Uke's death, and Oakland County medical examiner Dr. Lubisa Dragovich, who testified that an injection of potassium chloride had caused Uke's heart to stop. The video evidence spoke for itself. There was Kevorkian, on camera, administering a lethal injection to a man who then died. Kevorkian attempted to call witnesses who could testify about Uke's suffering and his desire to die. Thomas Uke's widow Melody and his brother Terence were willing to take the stand and speak on Kevorkian's behalf. But Judge Cooper ruled that their testimony was irrelevant. Since the assisted suicide charge had been dismissed, the only question before the jury was whether Kevorkian had intentionally killed Thomas Uke, whether Uke had consented to his death, whether he had been suffering, whether he had wanted to die. None of that mattered under the law. Murder is murder, regardless of the victim's wishes. Kevorkian rested his case without calling a single witness. In his closing argument, Kevorkian attempted to persuade the jury to look beyond the narrow legal question and consider the larger issues at stake. He compared himself to civil rights heroes Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., who had deliberately broken unjust laws in order to challenge them. There are certain acts, he told the jury, that by sheer common sense are not crimes. He argued that the law against euthanasia was unjust and that the jury had the power to refuse to enforce it by acquitting him. It was an appeal to what lawyers call jury nullification, the idea that jurors can disregard the law if they believe it would be unjust to apply it in a particular case. The prosecution countered that Kevorkian had deliberately defied the law, broadcast his defiance on national television, and dared authorities to stop him. Whatever one thought about euthanasia as a moral or political issue, this was a court of law. The evidence clearly showed that Kevorkian had intentionally ended Thomas Uke's life. That was murder. On March 26, 1999, after just 12 hours of deliberation over 2 days, the jury returned its verdict. They found Jack Kevorkian guilty of second-degree murder. They also found him guilty of delivery of a controlled substance. The jury had declined to convict him of first-degree murder, which would have required a finding of premeditation. Second-degree murder carried a maximum sentence of life in prison, but the sentencing guidelines for someone with no prior criminal record suggested a term of 10 to 25 years. Kevorkian stood silent as the verdict was read. He had finally gotten what he wanted, a murder conviction that he could appeal through the courts. But the price was his freedom. The sentencing hearing took place on April 13, 1999. Thomas Uke's widow Melody addressed the court, asking for leniency. She said her husband had come to the end of his life as he chose to live it. He was not depressed. He was not a victim. He had requested Kevorkian's help and was grateful for it. Uke would be greatly distressed, she said, that the man who had brought him peace at the end would now suffer on his account. Uke's brother Terence also spoke, describing Tom's final days. His lung capacity reduced to a fraction of normal, choking on his own saliva, in constant pain that morphine could not relieve. Kevorkian, he said, was the only person with the courage and fortitude to defy inadequate and unjust laws. But the prosecutor argued that Kevorkian had used Thomas Uke as a prop in his campaign to legalize euthanasia. He had broadcast a killing on national television and dared the authorities to stop him. The law had been clear, and Kevorkian had deliberately violated it. Judge Jessica Cooper delivered a lengthy statement before imposing sentence. She told Kevorkian that he had invited himself to the wrong forum. This trial was not an opportunity for a referendum on euthanasia. The law prohibiting euthanasia had been specifically reviewed and clarified by the Michigan Supreme Court in earlier cases involving Kevorkian himself. He should not have been surprised by the charges against him. "We are a nation of laws," Cooper said. "We tolerate differences of opinion because we have civilized, non-violent ways of resolving our conflicts. You can criticize the law, you can write about it, lecture about it, speak to the media, petition the voters, but you may not take the law into your own hands." She noted that Kevorkian had defied his own profession. The state had revoked his medical license 8 years earlier, yet he had continued to possess and administer controlled substances illegally. "You had the audacity," she told him, "to go on national television, show the world what you did, and dare the prosecution to stop you. Well, sir, consider yourself stopped." Judge Cooper sentenced Jack Kevorkian to 10 to 25 years in prison for the murder conviction. She also sentenced him to a concurrent term of 3 to 7 years for delivery of a controlled substance. Kevorkian would be eligible for parole after serving approximately 6 years and 8 months, assuming good behaviour. The judge denied his request to remain free on bail while he appealed the conviction. She said she could not trust his promise not to participate in more assisted suicides while free. This, she observed, was what he believed his life mission to be. She questioned whether he would ever cease and desist. Kevorkian, who had threatened to go on a hunger strike if imprisoned, was handcuffed and led from the courtroom. He was taken first to Oakland County Jail, then to the Southern Michigan Prison in Jackson for evaluation, and ultimately to the Lakeland Correctional Facility in Coldwater, Michigan, where he would serve his sentence. Kevorkian appealed his conviction through the Michigan courts and eventually sought review from the United States Supreme Court, but all his appeals were denied. The courts consistently upheld the conviction and the sentence. In November 2001, the Michigan Court of Appeals issued a detailed ruling affirming the conviction. The court found no error in Judge Cooper's decision to exclude testimony about Uke's suffering or his consent to die. Those factors were simply irrelevant to the question of whether Kevorkian had committed murder. The court also rejected Kevorkian's argument that his decision to represent himself had been coerced, or that he had received ineffective assistance from his standby counsel. He had been repeatedly warned about the risks of self-representation and had chosen to proceed anyway. Life in prison was difficult for Kevorkian. He was in his 70s, in declining health, and confined to a small cell. He continued to write and paint, preparing works for an exhibition of his art that opened at the Armenian Library and Museum of America in Massachusetts in 1999. In April 2000, while still incarcerated, he received the Gleitzman Citizen Activist of the Year award, with a sculpture designed by Maya Lin, the creator of the Vietnam War Memorial. Thomas Uke's family attended the ceremony and accepted the award on his behalf. Despite his conviction, Kevorkian retained supporters who viewed him as a martyr for the cause of death with dignity. In December 2005, Kevorkian applied for parole. The parole board denied his application by a vote of 7-2. By this time, Kevorkian was reportedly suffering from hepatitis C, a disease he had contracted decades earlier, and was expected to have only about a year to live. Kevorkian applied for parole again, and this time Governor Jennifer Granholm's office took notice of his deteriorating health. On June 1, 2007, after serving 8 years and 2.5 months of his sentence, Jack Kevorkian was released from the Lakeland Correctional Facility. He walked out of prison at approximately 10:15 in the morning, smiling brightly despite his frail condition. His attorney Maya Morgenroth and 60 Minutes correspondent Mike Wallace, who had conducted the fateful 1998 interview, were there to greet him. The terms of his parole were strict. He was prohibited from offering advice about, participating in, or being present at the act of any type of euthanasia involving any other person. He was also forbidden from promoting or even talking about the procedure of assisted suicide. If he violated these conditions, he could be sent back to prison immediately. Kevorkian largely honoured the terms of his parole. He gave lectures at universities including the University of Florida, Nova Southeastern University, and UCLA, though he spoke about topics like tyranny, the criminal justice system, and Armenian culture rather than euthanasia. He appeared on news programs and was interviewed by journalists. In 2008, at the age of 80, he announced that he would run for Congress as an independent candidate from Michigan's 9th District. He was badly defeated in the November election, receiving only 2.6% of the vote. In April 2010, HBO premiered a film about his life titled You Don't Know Jack, starring Al Pacino as Kevorkian. The film won several Emmy Awards and renewed public interest in his story. Jack Kevorkian died on June 3, 2011, at William Beaumont Hospital in Royal Oak, Michigan. He was 83 years old. He suffered from kidney and heart problems in his final years. The cause of death was reported as natural causes. His niece, Ava Janis, and his attorney, Maya Morgenroth, were at his bedside. In the days before his death, music by Johann Sebastian Bach, his lifelong musical idol, was played in his hospital room. The man who had devoted much of his life to helping others die peacefully ended his own life surrounded by family and friends, dying of natural causes in a hospital bed. It was perhaps a more conventional ending than he might have chosen for himself. The case of Thomas Yoke and the conviction of Jack Kevorkian marked a clear legal boundary in American law. It established unambiguously that regardless of a patient's consent, regardless of how much they are suffering, regardless of how terminal their illness might be, a physician who directly ends a patient's life commits murder. Assisted suicide, where the patient takes the final action themselves, occupies a different and more ambiguous legal space. Some states have since legalized it under strict conditions. Oregon passed the Death with Dignity Act in 1994, allowing terminally ill patients to request lethal medications from their doctors. Washington state passed similar legislation in 2008. Several other states have followed, but euthanasia, the direct killing of a patient by a physician, remains illegal throughout the United States. The Kevorkian case is routinely cited as the definitive precedent on this question. Thomas Uke's family never wavered in their support for Jack Kevorkian. They believed that he had given Tom a peaceful death and ended his suffering. Melody Uke, Tom's widow, continued to speak publicly about her husband's final days and her gratitude to Kevorkian for providing him relief. The family attended Kevorkian's award ceremonies and visited him in prison. They considered him a friend, not a murderer. But the law saw things differently. Whatever one believes about the morality of euthanasia, Whatever compassion one might feel for those suffering from incurable diseases, the legal system drew a line. Jack Kevorkian crossed it, and he paid the price. He served 8 years in prison for the death of Thomas Uke. He emerged an old man in failing health, forbidden from practicing the cause that had defined his life. He died 4 years later, his crusade ultimately unsuccessful in changing the law he had so passionately opposed. The debate over the right to die continues, but the Kevorkian case remains a cautionary tale about what happens when a physician takes the law into his own hands. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.